There is a place in northern Canada where the wind does not stop. It moves across the tundra like something with intention, like something that learned long ago that nothing out here was going to slow it down. The land is flat and enormous, and old in a way that makes the word old feel insufficient. It is a landscape that does not forgive distraction. Every stone on the ground has been there longer than most human civilizations have existed. Every ridge, every shallow frozen lake, every dried riverbed carries the weight of time in a way you can almost feel when you stand still long enough to let it settle into you. And somewhere in that landscape, built into the rock and the permafrost and the ancient soil, there are walls. Not the crumbling remnants of a forgotten settler's cabin. Not the kind of thing you could wave away as a natural formation, as frost heave or erosion or the random stacking of glacial debris. These are walls, deliberate, coursed, fitted, constructed. Stone placed on stone in configurations that do not occur in nature. Structures that stretch across the terrain in ways that suggest intention, planning, a mind working toward a purpose. The problem is that according to everything we think we know about human history in North America, these walls should not exist. The people who built them, whoever they were, should not have been in northern Canada 10,000 years ago with the knowledge and the organization and the reason to build them. The timeline does not work. The conventional story does not accommodate them, and yet there they are, sitting in the cold, waiting for someone to come along and ask the right questions. This is a story about those walls. It is also a story about what we do when the evidence refuses to cooperate with the narrative we have built around it. It is a story about the deep past of a continent that we think we know and almost certainly do not. It is a story about ice and stone and the people who moved across a world that looked nothing like the one we live in now. And it is a story about the strange, uncomfortable feeling that comes when you realize that the official version of history has been leaving something out. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The first thing you need to understand is what northern Canada actually looked like 10,000 years ago, because when most people picture that place and that time, they imagine something close to what it looks like today, just colder, just emptier. That is not what it was. The world at the end of the last ice age was a radically different place, and the land that would become northern Canada was at the center of that difference in ways that most of us have never been taught to appreciate. 11,000 years ago, a vast ice sheet covered most of what is now Canada. The Laurentide ice sheet, as geologists call it, was not just large, it was almost incomprehensibly large. At its peak, it covered roughly 10 million square kilometers. It was in places nearly 4 kilometers thick. The sheer weight of it depressed the land beneath it by hundreds of meters, pushing the crust of the earth down like a thumb pressed into soft clay. The ice held so much of the world's water locked in frozen form that global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today, which means that the coastlines of every continent looked completely different. Land bridges existed where there are now open oceans. Shallow continental shelves were dry ground. The map of the world you have in your head is the wrong map for understanding what was happening then. But the ice was retreating. It had been retreating for thousands of years, slowly and then faster and then slowly again, in pulses that responded to subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit and the amount of solar energy reaching different latitudes and different times of year. As it retreated, it revealed land. Not land like we think of land today, not land with soil ready for planting and rivers running clear. The land that emerged from beneath the ice was scraped raw, crushed and jumbled. The glaciers had ground down the bedrock over millennia, pulverizing it, carrying it, depositing it in strange configurations. They had carved deep channels and left behind enormous piles of debris called moraines. They had dropped boulders far from their origin, boulders that sit on the Canadian tundra today and geologists call erratic because they are made of rock that belongs nowhere near where they ended up. And as the ice retreated, water came. Meltwater. Enormous quantities of meltwater that collected behind ice dams and flooded vast areas and then broke loose catastrophically and drained in days what had taken centuries to accumulate. Proglacial lakes formed along the margins of the retreating ice. Lakes that in some cases were larger than any freshwater body that exists on Earth today. Lake Agassiz, which covered parts of what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and several American states, held more water than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. When it finally drained, somewhere around 8,000 years ago, the pulse of freshwater into the North Atlantic was large enough to have disrupted ocean circulation patterns and cooled large parts of the Northern Hemisphere for centuries. This was the world into which someone or something was building walls in northern Canada. This was the context, not a stable, familiar landscape, a landscape in violent transition, reshaping itself over centuries, presenting new terrain, new coastlines, new river systems, new possibilities for human movement and human settlement with every generation that passed. The people who lived through this period were not living in a static world. They were living in a world that was changing faster than most human societies have ever experienced. And this matters enormously when you try to understand the walls. Because if you assume that northern Canada 10,000 years ago was essentially what it is today, you will ask the wrong questions and reach the wrong conclusions. The people who built those walls, whoever they were operating in a landscape that no longer exists. They were reading a geography that has since been erased and rewritten. They were leaving behind evidence in terrain that was then subsequently buried, flooded, scraped by secondary glacial advances, uplifted by isostatic rebound as the weight of the ice came off the land, and in general, subjected to 10,000 years of geological violence that would have destroyed almost anything a human hand could have made. The wonder is not that there are questions about these walls. The wonder is that there are walls at all. Let us start with what has actually been found. Because there is a tendency in discussions of anomalous archaeology, and this is a topic that attracts its share of speculation, to be vague about the actual physical evidence, to speak in general terms about structures and formations, without grounding the conversation in specific places and specific things that specific researchers have actually documented. So let us try to be precise, understanding that precision in this field is genuinely difficult because the primary sources are often old or contested, or the sites themselves are in locations that have been visited by very few trained observers. The Peterborough petroglyph site in Ontario is not in the far north, but it establishes something important about the pre-Columbian complexity of stone culture in Canada. The petroglyphs there, carved into a large surface of crystalline limestone, number in the hundreds. They depict figures and symbols and geometric patterns. The Anishinaabe people who consider the site sacred call it Kinuamagewapkong, which translates roughly as the rocks that teach. The carvings have been dated to somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years ago, which puts them well within the range of documented indigenous occupation. They are not the anomaly, but they establish that stone as a medium for complex cultural expression was in use in Canada long before European arrival, and that the landscape holds records we are still learning to read. What is more difficult to place in any conventional narrative are the structures found in the interior of Baffin Island, at the northern end of Hudson Bay, and in the region of northern Quebec, known as Nunavik. Here, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 90s, as satellite imagery became available and aerial surveys became more systematic, researchers began documenting stone features that did not fit the known cultural inventory of the region, not tent rings, which are well understood as the simple circles of rocks used by Inuit and their predecessors to hold down the edges of skin tents. Not food caches, which are also well documented. Something else. Walls, alignments, enclosures, features that in some cases extended for dozens or even hundreds of meters across the landscape, following contours that suggested they were designed to channel something, to direct something, to define and separate space in purposeful ways. The researchers who first documented many of these features were not archaeologists looking for anomalies. They were geographers and geologists and hydrologists conducting resource surveys. They encountered these features in the course of work that had entirely different objectives, and their initial reports were embedded in documents that were never intended to reach a general audience, and in fact largely did not. The academic literature on anomalous stone features in northern Canada is fragmentary, dispersed across journals in multiple disciplines, and in some cases simply not published at all, existing only as field notes and survey reports in government archives. This is one of the frustrations of this subject. The evidence is real, the documentation exists, but it is scattered in a way that makes synthesis difficult, and the difficulty of synthesis has allowed a default position to persist, that these features are natural or that they are the work of known indigenous cultures working in ways that are simply not yet fully understood, or that they are not as anomalous as they appear to someone who has not spent significant time studying the archaeology of the region. That default position may be correct. Science proceeds by default positions and then refines or overturns them as evidence accumulates. The default position that the Earth was the center of the solar system was held by virtually everyone in European scientific culture for centuries and was wrong. The default position that humans arrived in the Americas no earlier than about 13,000 years ago and came in a single wave across a land bridge from Siberia has been substantially revised in the last 20 years, as evidence from sites in Chile and Texas and coastal British Columbia, and elsewhere has pushed the date of human presence in the Western Hemisphere significantly further back. Default positions can be wrong, and the question of who built the stone features of northern Canada is one where the default position deserves serious scrutiny. Begin with the question of the Dorset culture. The Dorset people, whom the Inuit called the Tuniat, were the pre-Inuit inhabitants of Arctic Canada and Greenland. They arrived in the Eastern Arctic sometime around 800 BCE, replacing or absorbing an even earlier group called the Arctic Small Tool Tradition people, who themselves had moved into the Canadian Arctic from Alaska sometime around 2500 BCE. The Dorset culture lasted until roughly 1000 CE, when the ancestors of the modern Inuit, the Thule people, moved rapidly eastward from Alaska and displaced the Dorset almost completely within a few centuries. The Dorset left behind a material culture that is well documented and recognizable. Their art, in particular, is remarkable. They carved small figurines of humans and animals and supernatural beings in ivory and bone. They made tools from stone that are distinctive enough in style that archaeologists can identify Dorset material at a glance. Their tent rings and semi-subterranean houses have been found across a huge swath of the Eastern Arctic. We know a reasonable amount about them, more than about many prehistoric peoples. But here is the problem. The Dorset arrived in the Canadian Arctic around 800 BCE. The stone features in question date, in some assessments, to periods that may substantially predate the Dorset. And even for the features that might fall within the Dorset window, the scale and complexity of some of what has been documented does not match what the Dorset are known to have built. The Dorset did not build long walls. They did not construct large enclosures. Their architectural repertoire, as far as it is understood, does not include the kinds of features that have been found in certain northern Quebec and Baffin Island locations, which pushes the inquiry further back. Before the Dorset, before the Arctic small tool tradition, there were people in northern Canada. We know this because their traces have been found, mostly in the form of stone tools, occasionally in the form of more substantial features, at sites that have been reliably dated to earlier periods. The pre-Dorset cultures, as they are called in the literature, are less well understood than the Dorset precisely because they are older and their remains are harder to find and harder to date. But they were there, and before them there were the Paleo-Indians, the earliest human inhabitants of the continent, whose descendants spread across North and South America in the millennia following the retreat of the ice. And the question that sits at the center of this whole puzzle is whether any of these early groups, or perhaps a group we have not yet identified, or perhaps something else entirely, left behind the stone features that do not fit the accepted narrative. There is a location in northern Quebec, in the region between the eastern shore of Hudson Bay and the Labrador coast, where the land has a particular quality of stillness that people who have been there describe in almost identical terms. It is not the stillness of a place where nothing happens. It is the stillness of a place where nothing has changed in a very long time. The bedrock here is some of the oldest on Earth, part of the Canadian Shield, which is the ancient crystalline core of the North American continent. The shield formed roughly 4 billion years ago, give or take a few 100 million years. When you put your hand on the exposed rock of the Canadian Shield, you are touching something that was already old when the first single-celled organisms were learning to photosynthesize. On that ancient rock, in locations that are accessible only by helicopter or by canoe routes that require multiple portages and weeks of travel, there are stone features that the Cree people of the region have known about for a very long time. The Cree word for some of these places translates roughly as the places where the old ones worked, which is itself interesting, because it implies a recognition that whatever made these features was not the Cree themselves, but something that predated them. Oral traditions among the Cree and Inuit of this region include references to beings who lived on the land before the arrival of human people, who were powerful and strange, and who eventually left or were driven away, or simply disappeared into the rock and the wind. These oral traditions are not evidence of ancient alien construction. They are evidence of deep time memory, of cultural transmission across many generations, of something that the people of the region knew had happened on their land before their own history began. Indigenous oral traditions are increasingly recognized by researchers as potentially preserving accurate information about events that occurred thousands of years in the past. Studies have shown that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions include accurate descriptions of coastline changes that occurred when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, more than 7,000 years ago. Maori traditions in New Zealand include accurate accounts of the megafauna that lived on the islands when their ancestors arrived, animals that have been extinct for centuries. The idea that oral traditions are simply myth, simply story disconnected from historical reality, is a prejudice of literate cultures that does not survive contact with the actual evidence. So when the Cree speak of the old ones who built things in the land, that deserves to be taken seriously as a pointer towards something real, it does not tell us who or what built those things. It does not give us a blueprint or a timeline, but it tells us that the human memory of this region includes an awareness that the stone features are not the work of recent generations, that they belong to a different chapter of the land's history than the one currently lived by the people who inhabit it. Now let us talk about the Inuksut. Because the Inuksut are the thing that most people reach for when they try to explain away the stone features of northern Canada, and the explanation, while applicable to some features, does not work for all of them. And understanding why requires understanding what Inuksut actually are and what they are not. An Inuksuk, singular, of Inuksut, is a human-made stone figure or structure used by the Inuit and their predecessors across the Arctic. The word means roughly something which acts in the capacity of a human being. Inuksut were used for navigation, to mark trails and food caches and hunting grounds. They were used as decoys in caribou hunts, where lines of Inuksut would be constructed to channel caribou toward hunters waiting at a crossing point. They were used as message systems, with the shape and orientation of a structure conveying information to travelers who knew how to read them. They were and are important cultural objects, and they remain in use today. Inuksut are genuine, well-documented, culturally meaningful stone structures built by real people for real purposes. The problem with invoking them to explain the anomalous features of northern Canada is that the anomalous features are not Inuksut. The features in question are not stone figures. They are not isolated structures marking individual locations. They are walls. Extended, coursed, fitted walls that run for distances that make no sense as navigation markers or caribou drive structures. Some of the walls follow ridgelines in ways that suggest they were designed to be hidden from below, which is the opposite of what you would want from a navigation marker. Some form enclosures whose interior areas are too large to be practical, as simple storage structures, and too irregular to be understood as habitations. The distinction matters because the Inuksuk explanation is very often applied without any serious examination of whether the specific features being discussed actually resemble Inuksut. They do not. Whatever built the walls of northern Canada was not building Inuksut, it was building something else. Now, come a little closer to specifics. There is a set of features on the Ungava Peninsula, the northeastern extremity of Quebec, that juts up into Hudson Strait, that has attracted serious scholarly attention since at least the 1960s. The Ungava Peninsula is one of the most remote inhabited regions of Canada. The population centre of Kuujjuaq, at the mouth of the Coxsackie River, has fewer than 3,000 people and is accessible only by air. The interior of the peninsula is essentially uninhabited, a vast expanse of boreal forest transitioning to open tundra as you move north, cut by rivers that drain into Ungava Bay on one side and Hudson Bay on the other. Within this landscape, at locations that require significant effort to reach, there are stone constructions that do not fit the archaeological record as it is conventionally understood. Some of these features were first systematically documented by Thomas Lee, a Canadian archaeologist who conducted fieldwork on the Ungava Peninsula and on the shores of Payne Lake, known in Inuktitut as Tasijuak in the 1960s and 70s. Lee's work was controversial at the time, and remains so, partly because his conclusions challenged established chronologies, and partly because the institutions that sponsored his research, including the National Museum of Canada, were not uniformly supportive of the directions his findings pointed. Lee documented what he described as longhouses at Paine Lake and other Ungava Peninsula sites. Longhouses are large, rectangular, multi-room structures built to shelter a significant number of people. They are associated in North American archaeology with certain eastern woodland cultures, with the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and other peoples of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence regions. They are not associated with the Arctic and subarctic regions, where Lee claimed to have found them. Lee's interpretation of the Ungava features as longhouses was met with considerable skepticism by the mainstream archaeological community, which preferred explanations rooted in known Dorset or pre-Dorset building traditions. But Lee was not an amateur. He had legitimate credentials and had conducted legitimate fieldwork, and the features he documented were real. Whether his interpretation of them as longhouses was correct is a separate question from whether the features themselves represent something anomalous. The photographs he took, published in academic journals, show stone structures that are genuinely difficult to explain within the conventional framework of subarctic prehistory. The debate about what they are and who built them is not settled. There is something else at Paine Lake that deserves attention. The lake itself is enormous by any standard, covering roughly 1,300 square kilometers, sitting in the interior of the Ungava Peninsula at an elevation that makes it visible from a great distance under clear skies. The Inuit name for it, Tasijuak, means the very large lake, which is appropriately straightforward. In the Cree oral tradition, the lake is associated with events of great significance that occurred before the current age of the world, events that are described in terms that mix the literal and the metaphorical in ways that make direct historical interpretation difficult, but that consistently suggest the lake was a place of human activity long before the current human populations of the region arrived. The orientation of some of the stone features near Paine Lake is worth noting. Several of the wall segments and enclosures have alignments that, when plotted against the astronomical data for the region at various periods in the past, seem to correspond to significant solar and lunar events. Sunrise and sunset at the solstices and equinoxes. Lunar standstills. The kind of celestial orientations that appear in stone monuments across Europe and the Near East in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, and that are generally understood as evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge being embedded in the built environment. Now, here is where the standard skeptical response would be to point out that any sufficiently long wall or any arrangement of multiple structures will, by chance, have some alignment with some astronomical event if you look hard enough. This is a fair methodological point. You can find any pattern if you are looking for it and willing to cherry-pick your data. The statistical significance of astronomical alignments in prehistoric structures is a genuinely contested area of archaeoastronomy, and not every claimed alignment survives rigorous analysis. But the alignments at some of the Ungava Peninsula sites were not identified by enthusiasts looking for confirmation of a predetermined theory. They were identified in the course of systematic surveys by researchers using standard methods, and the alignments are not isolated coincidences, but recurring patterns across multiple structures at multiple sites. That does not prove anything, but it is the kind of thing that warrants serious examination rather than dismissal. Let us step back and think about what it would mean if there were, in fact, stone structures in northern Canada that predate all known human cultures of the region by a significant margin. What would that imply? What would have to be true? It would have to be true that people with the knowledge and organization to plan and execute substantial construction projects were present in northern Canada at a time when, according to the conventional narrative, the region was either uninhabited or inhabited only by small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers who left no substantial permanent structures. It would have to be true that those people had a reason to build walls, which means they had something to define, something to enclose, something to defend, or something to express through architecture. It would have to be true that those people and their constructions were subsequently erased from the archaeological record almost completely, leaving behind only the most durable elements of what they built and almost no other trace. Each of those conditions is individually possible. Together, they describe a scenario that seems improbable but is not impossible, and the question is whether the evidence, taken as a whole, makes that scenario more or less likely than the alternatives. The alternatives include the possibility that the features are natural. Glacial processes can produce remarkably regular-looking stone features. Frost heave, the cycle of freezing and thawing that operates in the permafrost zone, can move rocks and create patterns that look structured. Polygonal ground, a common phenomenon in the Arctic caused by the cycling of ice wedges in the soil, creates regular geometric patterns at the surface that can be mistaken for human construction from the air. These are real phenomena that real researchers have been fooled by before, and any honest assessment of the anomalous stone features of northern Canada has to take seriously the possibility that at least some of what has been interpreted as human construction is actually the work of geological processes. But not all of it. The features that have been most carefully examined, the ones that have been studied on the ground by people with experience recognizing natural stone formations in periglacial environments, are not explained by frost heave or ice wedge polygons or glacial deposition. The coursing of stone in some of these walls, the deliberate fitting of stone to create a stable structure, the consistent orientation and the relationship between individual features that suggests they were planned as a group rather than created independently. These things are not what geological processes produce. Geology does not build enclosures. Geology does not fit stone to stone. Geology does not create walls that follow ridgelines while maintaining a consistent height above the surrounding terrain. Someone built these things. The question is, who, and when, and why? Here is a name that comes up repeatedly in serious discussions of this subject: the pre-Dorset. Not the Arctic small tool tradition people, though they are part of the same broad lineage, but specifically the cultural phases that bridge the gap between the very earliest human occupation of the eastern Arctic and the emergence of what archaeologists recognize as the Dorset culture. These are the people who were in northern Canada from roughly 5,000 years ago to roughly 3,000 years ago, during the period called the Middle to Late Archaic in the broader North American cultural sequence. The pre-Dorset people are not well understood. They are known primarily from their small tools, the delicate microblades and scrapers and projectile points that are the hallmark of the Arctic small tool tradition. They were clearly capable hunters and fishers. They were mobile, moving with the seasons and with the movements of the game they depended on. Their social organization, their ritual life, their architecture, if they had any, these are largely unknown, because the organic materials that would tell us most about those aspects of their existence have not survived the 10,000 years since their time. But there is evidence, from scattered sites across the eastern Arctic, that some groups within the pre-Dorset tradition did build substantial semi-permanent structures. There are winter habitation sites where the stone outlines of houses, larger than simple windbreaks, have been identified, where the accumulation of food refuse and other debris suggests repeated occupation over many years. The pre-Dorset were not simply nomadic hunters with no fixed points in their landscape. They had places they returned to, places that mattered to them, places where they invested labor in making the land accommodate their needs. Could the pre-Dorset have built the walls? They could have. They were present in the right region during the right period, and they are known to have built structures more substantial than tent rings in at least some locations. But the scale of some of the features that have been documented, and more importantly the technical sophistication evident in the fitting and coursing of the stone, seems to exceed what is otherwise known of pre-Dorset construction. That may simply reflect the limits of our knowledge about the pre-Dorset, which is genuinely limited, or it may reflect the fact that the walls were not built by the pre-Dorset at all. Let us talk about the sea, because the sea is central to this story in a way that is easy to miss if you are thinking about northern Canada only in terms of its current geography. 10,000 years ago, the sea around northern Canada was not where it is now. The coastlines were different. In some regions, areas that are now submerged were dry land. In other regions, areas that are now dry land were submerged under post-glacial lakes or under the sea itself. Hudson Bay, the enormous inland sea that dominates the map of eastern Canada, was only beginning to fill with seawater around 8,000 years ago, as the weight of the Laurentide ice sheet came off the land and allowed the depressed bedrock to begin its slow rebound. Before that, the Hudson Bay Basin was largely occupied by ice, or by meltwater, with the precise configuration changing year by year as the ice retreated. The coast of the Ungava Peninsula, where some of the most anomalous stone features have been found, would have looked completely different 10,000 years ago. The shoreline of Ungava Bay would have been in a different location. The river systems draining into the bay would have had different courses. The land itself would have been at a different elevation, because the isostatic rebound from the removal of the ice sheet's weight is still ongoing, and the land has been rising for thousands of years. When you look at a map of the Ungava Peninsula today and try to imagine where people 10,000 years ago might have wanted to build permanent structures, you are looking at the wrong map. This is a fundamental problem for the archaeology of the post-glacial period everywhere in the world. The human occupation of the landscape at the time of the great environmental transitions happened on a different landscape than the one that exists today. The most productive coastal environments, the estuaries and river mouths, and shallow bays, where marine resources would have been most abundant and where human settlements would naturally have concentrated, are now underwater. They were drowned by the rising seas of the post-glacial period, and with them went the evidence of the people who lived there. What survives is what was built inland, at elevations that the rising seas did not reach. If people in northern Canada 10,000 years ago were living primarily at the coast, which is where marine hunter-gatherers generally live because that is where the food is, then the stone features we are finding inland may be something other than habitations. They may be the inland components of a culture whose coastal heartland is now underwater. They may be ceremonial structures, territorial markers, hunting facilities, or seasonal camps used by people whose primary settlements are gone forever. This hypothesis does not resolve the mystery of the walls, but it reframes it in a way that makes the anomaly slightly less anomalous. If the walls are not the central achievement of the culture that built them, but rather the peripheral and relatively minor constructions left behind when that culture moved inland for specific seasonal purposes, then the fact that we can find the walls but cannot find the settlements makes sense. The settlements are under the sea. This is not speculation. Underwater archaeology in other parts of the world has found substantial evidence of human habitation in areas that were dry land during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. In the Persian Gulf, which was largely a fertile river valley rather than a sea until roughly 7,000 years ago, archaeologists have found evidence of human settlement in what is now open water. Off the coast of India, submerged structures at sites like Dwarka and the Gulf of Cambay have been identified by sonar and underwater survey, though the dating and interpretation of these sites remain contested. The coast of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico preserves evidence of human activity in underwater caves that were dry during the Ice Age, including human skeletal remains that have been dated to more than 12,000 years ago. There is every reason to think that the shallow coastal waters of eastern Canada and the Arctic archipelago preserve evidence of human activity from the post-glacial period. There has simply been very little systematic effort to find it, partly because underwater archaeology in Arctic waters is extraordinarily difficult and expensive, and partly because the conventional narrative of early human occupation of the Arctic does not give researchers strong reasons to look. Now let us move to something that complicates the picture in a different way. Let us talk about what happened to the Dorset people, because what happened to them is one of the great mysteries of Arctic prehistory, and it may be related to the mystery of the walls in ways that are not immediately obvious. The Dorset culture lasted for roughly 2,000 years, from about 800 BCE to about 1000 CE. During that time, they were the dominant human culture of the eastern Arctic, from Greenland in the east to Banks Island in the west, from Baffin Island in the north to the coast of Labrador in the south. They were remarkably adapted to Arctic conditions. Their material culture was sophisticated and consistent across a huge geographic range, which implies either extensive trade and contact networks or a high degree of cultural coherence maintained across very large distances. And then they disappeared. The Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, arrived in the eastern Arctic from Alaska around 1000 CE, moving rapidly eastward and reaching Greenland within a few centuries. Within a surprisingly short time, the Dorset were gone. The Thule arrived and the Dorset vanished. How? Why? This is not a simple question. The Thule were technologically formidable. They had the umiak, the large open boat capable of hunting bowhead whales. which gave them access to food resources that the Dorset could not exploit. They had the kayak, the dog sled, and a range of hunting technologies that were in some ways superior to the Dorset toolkit. The Thule's ability to hunt bowhead whales, some of the largest animals on Earth, gave them a caloric surplus that could support larger and more complex social organizations. But the Dorset had been living successfully in the eastern Arctic for 2,000 years. They were not helpless. They had their own adaptations, their own knowledge of the land and sea, their own social structures. The idea that the Thule simply rolled over the Dorset by virtue of technological superiority is probably too simple. There is evidence from some sites of Thule-Dorset interaction, possibly including trade. There is evidence that in some areas, Dorset people may have survived alongside Thule populations for some time before finally disappearing. Some researchers have suggested that the Norse, who were present in Greenland and possibly the Canadian Arctic from around 1000 CE, may have played a role in the disappearance of the Dorset, though this is speculative. The Norse sagas describe encounters with people called the Skraelings in the western Atlantic, and the Skraelings have been interpreted variously as the ancestors of the Inuit, as Dorset people, and as indigenous peoples further south. What actually happened when Norse explorers encountered Dorset people, if they did, is not known. What is known is that the Dorset left behind a remarkable body of art. The small carved figures they made in ivory and bone are among the most compelling prehistoric objects in the world. They include human figures with distorted or masked faces, bears in postures that suggest transformation or supernatural power, birds with human features, and a range of abstract objects whose purpose is not understood. The Dorset art tradition seems to express a rich cosmological and spiritual worldview, a sense of a world populated by powerful non-human beings that required careful attention and appropriate ritual behavior. The Inuit oral tradition includes stories of the Tuniat, the Dorset people. These stories are consistent across geographically distant groups that could not have shared the stories through recent contact, which suggests they preserve genuinely old memories. The Tuniat are described as large, strong, peaceful people who were easily frightened. They are said to have been able to perform extraordinary physical feats, like carrying very heavy loads, but to have been poor fighters. The Inuit stories suggest that the Tuniat and the Inuit ancestors coexisted for some time, that there was conflict between them, and that ultimately the Tuniat departed, either driven away or simply melting into the Thule population through intermarriage. Genetic analysis has added complexity to this picture. The Dorset do not appear to have contributed significant amounts of DNA to the modern Inuit population, which is surprising if the two groups lived alongside each other for any substantial period. The genetic signature of the Dorset is effectively absent from modern Arctic peoples, which suggests either that the contact between Thule and Dorset was minimal, or that the Dorset population was so small relative to the Thule by the time they met, that the genetic signal was effectively diluted away, or that the Dorset people truly disappeared without leaving descendants. The mystery of the Dorset is relevant to the mystery of the walls, because the Dorset may have been interacting with, living among, or building on top of features left by earlier cultures. The stone features of the Ungava Peninsula and Baffin Island exist in a landscape that the Dorset also inhabited, and it is possible that the Dorset understood those features better than we do, that their oral traditions included an account of who made them and why. If so, that account died with the Dorset when they disappeared from the record around 1000 CE. Or perhaps the Dorset made some of the features themselves. There is a period in Dorset cultural development around the transition between the early and middle Dorset phases, roughly 2500 to 1500 years ago, when there seems to have been an intensification of ritual activity, an elaboration of the symbolic dimensions of Dorset culture that is not yet fully understood. Some researchers have suggested that this intensification may have coincided with increased social complexity, with the development of more fixed territorial patterns, and possibly with a greater investment in permanent landscape modification. If the Middle Dorset were building ceremonial or territorial stone structures, the scale and character of what they built might not have been fully documented, because the sites where such structures would be found are in remote locations that have not been systematically surveyed. The Ungava Peninsula and northern Baffin Island are not places where archaeological fieldwork is easy or cheap. Most of what is known about these regions comes from surveys conducted for resource development purposes, not from systematic archaeological investigation designed to find and document cultural features. Let us think about the wall at the end of Paine Lake for a moment, not metaphorically, literally. Stand in your imagination at the eastern end of Tasijuaq, the very large lake, in the interior of the Ungava Peninsula. The wind comes off the lake cold even in July. The ground beneath your feet is a mixture of bare rock and thin, wet soil. The vegetation, where there is any, is low and tough, sedges and mosses and dwarf willows that press themselves against the land rather than reaching up into the wind. The sky is enormous. You are aware, in a way that is difficult to articulate, that you are very far from anywhere that would recognize you or care whether you were there. And there, running along the ridge that forms the northern shore of the lake's eastern basin, are stones that have been placed by a hand. Not thrown, not tumbled into position by glacial action, not arranged by frost heave, placed, one stone on another, in a configuration that extends for enough distance that you cannot explain it as the work of an afternoon's boredom. This took effort. This took time. This required carrying stones from somewhere to place them here, and the act of carrying them implies a reason, a plan, a purpose that the person doing the carrying understood and committed to. Why here? Why this ridge above this lake? The lake is substantial enough to support fish. The surrounding land would have supported caribou during migration periods. The location is defensible in the sense that it is elevated and commands views in multiple directions. But defensibility implies a threat, and a threat implies neighbors or enemies, and neighbors and enemies imply a degree of social complexity and territorial organization that is not, according to the conventional narrative, expected of the people who were in this region at the relevant time. Unless the conventional narrative is wrong about who was here and what their social complexity looked like, there is a body of research, not fringe research but peer-reviewed academic work published in serious journals, that suggests the peopling of the Americas was considerably more complex than the model that dominated the field for most of the 20th century. The Clovis First model, which held that the first Americans were the Clovis people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia around 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly across both continents, has been substantially challenged over the last 30 years. Pre-Clovis sites have been found and validated at multiple locations in the Americas, pushing the earliest confirmed date of human presence in the Western Hemisphere to at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier. The Monteverde site in Chile, which has been reliably dated to around 14,500 years ago, and possibly as early as 33,000 years ago, at its lowest levels, is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, precisely because it forced a reconsideration of when and how the Americas were peopled. Monteverde is in southern Chile, as far from the Bering Land Bridge as you can get while still being in South America. Getting there from the land bridge in the time available, assuming the conventional chronology, requires a speed of southward migration that strains credulity. Either the Americas were peopled much earlier than Clovis first assumed, or people got to the southern tip of South America by a route other than the interior of the continent, specifically by sea. The coastal migration hypothesis has gained considerable support in recent years. It proposes that some of the earliest Americans moved southward along the Pacific coast of North and South America by boat, following the kelp forest ecosystem that would have provided food and shelter along the coast, even when the interior of the continent was still glaciated. This hypothesis is supported by the distribution of early archaeological sites, by genetic data, and by the fact that people capable of reaching Australia by sea at least 50,000 years ago were clearly capable of maritime travel of a kind that could have brought them to the Americas. If some of the earliest Americans were maritime people who moved along the coast, they would have been in the region of what is now northern Canada and the Arctic earlier than the interior migration model suggests. They would have had the technology to navigate coastal waters and the ecological knowledge to exploit marine resources. And they might have built structures along the coast that are now underwater, with only the inland components of their occupation surviving on the surface. This is speculative, but it is not irresponsible speculation. It is the kind of hypothesis that is generated by the available evidence when you take that evidence seriously rather than forcing it into a predetermined framework. The evidence includes the dates of known pre-Clovis sites, the genetic analysis of early American populations, the distribution of stone tool traditions across the continent, and yes, the stone features of northern Canada that do not fit the conventional narrative. There is one more piece of evidence that deserves its own consideration, and it is perhaps the most unsettling piece for those who are committed to a simple narrative of North American prehistory. It is the genetic evidence for an ancient population in the Americas that does not have a clear connection to the populations that are currently believed to have peopled the continent. In 2015, researchers analyzing ancient DNA from individuals buried at a site in Brazil called Lagoa Santa, a site where human remains have been dated to approximately 10,000 years ago, found something unexpected. The genetic signature of the Lagoa Santa individuals showed stronger affinities to indigenous Australians and Melanesians than to the Siberian populations from which the ancestors of most Native Americans are thought to be derived. This finding was subsequently confirmed and elaborated by additional analysis, and it has been interpreted as evidence that a population, sometimes called Population Y, or Australo-Melanesians or Paleo-Americans, contributed to the ancestry of some early American populations. Who were these people, and how did they get to the Americas? This is one of the genuinely open questions in human population genetics, and the honest answer is that we do not know. One hypothesis is that they crossed the Pacific directly from Australia or Melanesia by boat, a crossing of enormous distance that would have required sophisticated maritime capability. Another hypothesis is that they were part of an earlier wave of migration from Asia that followed a different route than the later wave that produced most Native American ancestry. A third hypothesis is that there were people in the Americas much earlier than currently believed, people whose origins are not yet understood, who were subsequently largely replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. If any of these hypotheses is correct, it implies that the human history of the Americas, before approximately 15,000 years ago, is substantially different from, and more complex, than the conventional narrative suggests. It implies that there were people in the Americas, including the northern part of the continent, with potentially sophisticated capabilities, building knowledge, and social organization, who have been largely erased from our understanding of the continent's past. And if those people built walls in northern Canada, the walls would be there now, in the landscape, waiting to be understood. We have been circling around the question of who built the walls. Let us now try to approach it more directly. Let us try to reason from the evidence toward a set of possibilities, acknowledging that the evidence is incomplete and that any conclusion we reach is necessarily provisional. Possibility 1. The walls are natural formations that have been misidentified as human construction. This is the most parsimonious explanation and should not be dismissed. Periglacial environments produce remarkable stone features through natural processes, and even experienced observers can be fooled. The wall-like appearance of some of the features may reflect the operation of natural forces rather than human hands. However, this possibility does not account for all of the features that have been documented. Some of the structures, particularly those that have been examined closely by researchers with experience in periglacial geomorphology, show characteristics that cannot be explained by known natural processes. The deliberate fitting of stone, the consistent orientations relative to topographic features and astronomical events, the relationships between individual structures that suggest they were planned and built as a group, these things are not what geological processes produce. Possibility 2. The walls were built by known indigenous cultures of the region, specifically the pre-Dorset, the Dorset, or earlier Paleo-Indian populations, using building traditions that have not yet been fully documented. This is a reasonable possibility, and the one preferred by most mainstream archaeologists who acknowledge that the features are real. The problem with this possibility is that it requires those cultures to have building traditions that are substantially more sophisticated than anything currently known from their other remains. It requires them to have had reasons to build large, carefully constructed stone walls that are not consistent with the known patterns of their economic and social life. And it requires the features to have been built at some point within the last 5,000 years, when those cultures are known to have been present in the region, rather than at any earlier date. If the walls are attributable to known cultures, they should be explicable in terms of those cultures' known needs and capabilities. The fact that they are not fully explicable in those terms is what makes them anomalous. If a simple attribution to the Dorset or pre-Dorset accounted for the features, they would not be anomalous, and this conversation would not be necessary. Possibility 3. The walls were built by people who were in northern Canada earlier than currently believed. People whose presence is not yet reflected in the documented archaeological record, either because their sites have not been found, or because they have been misidentified, or because they are underwater. This possibility accommodates the genetic evidence for population Y, the pre-Clovis evidence from multiple American sites, and the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region, who consistently refer to builders who preceded their own ancestors. This possibility is more difficult to evaluate because it requires the existence of something we do not have direct evidence for, an undocumented population with the capability and motivation to build substantial stone structures in northern Canada at some point before 5,000 years ago. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a region as archaeologically understudied as the northern Canadian interior. Possibility 4. The walls were built by visitors from outside the Americas. This is the most dramatic possibility and the one most associated with alternative history and fringe archaeology. So let us be careful about it. The hypothesis of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas is not fringe. There is solid, peer-reviewed evidence for Norse presence in Newfoundland around 1000 CE at the site of Lanson Meadows, which is not a hypothesis, but a documented archaeological fact. There is growing evidence for contact between Polynesian voyagers and South America, based on the presence of the sweet potato, which is a South American domesticate in Polynesia centuries before European arrival, and on genetic evidence for genetic mixing between Polynesian and South American populations. The hypothesis that there was pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and northern Canada is not as well supported as the Norse evidence, but it is not baseless. There are stone features in Newfoundland and Labrador that some researchers have attributed to early Norse or other European visitors. There are claims, contested but not dismissed, of Basque, Breton, and Irish fishermen reaching the Grand Banks of Newfoundland decades before the official date of Columbus's voyage. And there are traditions in some Celtic and Scandinavian cultures of voyages to lands in the far west, some of which may be distorted memories of actual contact. None of this explains the walls in the interior of the Ungava Peninsula or on the tundra of Baffin Island. Coastal contact, if it occurred, would leave evidence along the coast, not deep in the interior of the continent. If Old World visitors built the anomalous stone features of northern Canada, they would have had to penetrate hundreds of kilometers inland, which implies not a casual contact or a brief landing, but a sustained presence and engagement with the land. That is a large thing to propose. It is the kind of thing that requires very strong evidence. The evidence that exists is suggestive but not conclusive. It is the kind of evidence that keeps the question open rather than closing it. The question of why the walls were built, if they were built by people rather than by nature, matters as much as the question of who built them, because the why might help us understand the who, and vice versa. What would motivate any human group to invest the labor required to build extended stone walls in an extremely harsh environment where the available human population would have been small and the competition for labor time intense? There are several possible answers. Walls for defense are one of the oldest motivations for construction in human history. From the Neolithic period in Europe to the Bronze Age in the Near East to the pre-Columbian Americas, people have built walls to control access to territory, to protect settlements, and to signal territorial claims to other groups. If the people of northern Canada 10,000 years ago were competing for resources, as human groups in all environments tend to do when population reaches certain densities, walls make sense as territorial markers and defensive infrastructure. But defense presupposes a threat, and a threat presupposes neighbors. If the walls are 10,000 years old and were built by a relatively small population of hunter-gatherers, who were those walls defending against? Who was the threat? If we are imagining a landscape of sparse, mobile bands spread across an enormous territory, the need for defensive walls seems disproportionate. Walls are an investment that makes sense when you have something valuable in a fixed location that is worth protecting. What did the builders of the northern Canadian walls have that was worth building walls to protect? This question leads back to the possibility of settlement, more complex than the simple hunting camp model. If there were settlements with stored food, with accumulated material goods, with concentrated populations, those settlements would be worth defending. And the existence of such settlements in northern Canada 10,000 years ago would be a significant departure from the conventional understanding of the period. A second possibility is that the walls were built for hunting purposes. The use of stone walls, drives, and enclosures to hunt caribou and other large game is well documented in Arctic archaeology. Drive systems, in which lines of stones or other markers were used to channel caribou toward a killing ground, are found across the Arctic and subarctic and are sometimes quite elaborate. Long lines of stones, sometimes extending for many kilometers, were used to guide caribou movements during migration. At the end of these drives, hunters waited at crossings or in concealed positions. Some of the features in northern Canada could potentially be interpreted as components of a large-scale caribou drive system. If the walls were used to channel animals rather than to confine or defend people, the scale and complexity of the construction makes more sense. A drive system that worked would repay the investment in its construction many times over, providing the hunters who built it with a reliable source of food during the critical migration periods. The problem with this interpretation is that the specific geometry of some of the features does not match what would be optimal for a hunting drive. Effective drive systems are typically funnel-shaped, narrowing toward the killing area. Some of the northern Canadian features form enclosures or box-like configurations that do not have an obvious role in directing animal movement. And the locations of some of the features on ridgelines and hilltops, rather than in the valley bottoms and lake margins, where caribou crossings would typically be found, do not fit the hunting drive model. A third possibility is ceremonial or cosmological. Throughout human history, people have built large and difficult structures for reasons that had nothing to do with practical economics. Stonehenge was not a practical building. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were not practical buildings in any straightforward sense. The pyramids of Egypt and Mexico were not built because they were the most efficient solution to a practical problem. Humans build monuments, and they build them because they need to express something that cannot be expressed any other way, a relationship to the cosmos, to the dead, to the divine, to time itself. If the walls of northern Canada are ceremonial structures, they would not need to make economic sense. They would need to make ritual or cosmological sense, to be oriented correctly relative to the movements of the sun and moon, to be located in places of spiritual significance, to embody in stone a set of beliefs about the structure of the world and humanity's place in it. And the evidence that some of the features are oriented astronomically, however contested that evidence is, points in this direction. Ceremonial stone structures built by hunter-gatherers are not without precedent in North America. Cahokia, in what is now Illinois, was built by agricultural people, but the great earthwork monuments of the Hopewell and Adena cultures, which predate Cahokia and are found across the eastern United States, were built by people whose economies were not primarily agricultural. The construction of Poverty Point in Louisiana, one of the largest prehistoric earthwork complexes in North America, began around 3,500 years ago and was carried out by people who were primarily hunters and gatherers. The labor required to build Poverty Point was enormous, far more than would have been needed for any practical purpose, and its scale and design strongly suggest a cosmological motivation. If the nomadic or semi-nomadic people of northern Canada 10,000 years ago had a sufficiently developed cosmological worldview, they might have invested in building ceremonial stone structures for the same reasons that people in other parts of the world invested in building earthwork monuments and stone circles. The fact that the northern Canadian structures are made of stone rather than earth reflects nothing more than the fact that stone was the available material. Earth is difficult to work in a permafrost environment. Stone is everywhere, and this brings us to one of the most interesting and least discussed aspects of this story, the connection between the stone features of northern Canada and the broader phenomenon of stone monument building that occurred across much of the world during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Göbekli Tepe, in what is now Turkey, perhaps the oldest substantial stone monument complex in the world, was built beginning around 12,000 years ago by people who were hunter-gatherers, not farmers. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are estimated to have required hundreds of workers to quarry, transport, and erect the enormous stone pillars that are the site's most distinctive feature. Those workers had to be fed, organized, and coordinated over long periods. The existence of Göbekli Tepe has fundamentally changed archaeologists' understanding of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of, demonstrating that complex social organization and the capacity for large-scale cooperative construction projects were not dependent on agriculture. If hunter-gatherers in what is now Turkey were building stone monuments 12,000 years ago, why not hunter-gatherers in what is now northern Canada? The cognitive and social capabilities that made Göbekli Tepe possible were not exclusive to the Middle East. Homo sapiens spread across the world carrying the same basic cognitive toolkit. The particular expressions of that toolkit that emerged in different parts of the world reflected the specific environments, resources, and cultural traditions of each region, but the underlying capacity was the same everywhere. The stone of northern Canada was ready to be worked. The human intelligence needed to plan and execute complex constructions was present. The social organization that could coordinate labor over significant periods existed, or could have existed, in populations that we know were in the region. The only thing missing from the conventional narrative is the specific evidence that such construction actually occurred. And the walls are that evidence. However contested, however difficult to date and interpret, the walls are evidence that someone applied human intentionality to the stones of northern Canada in a deliberate and purposeful way. The question is not whether that happened. The walls are there. The question is what it means. It means that the story of northern Canada, and by extension the story of pre-Columbian North America, is more complex than we have been told. It means that the human history of this continent did not begin with the arrival of specific, well-documented cultures at specific, well-documented dates. It began much earlier, in environments that we have barely begun to explore, by people whose names we do not know, and whose beliefs and motivations we can only guess at from the stones they left behind. The stones. Let us come back to the stones. There is something about the physical reality of these features that tends to get lost in discussions of their origin and significance. They are not abstractions. They are not data points in a spreadsheet. They are rocks, carefully placed by hands, in a landscape that is still there, still cold, still enormous, still largely unknown to the world outside. The people who placed those rocks were flesh and blood. They breathed the same cold air that blows across the Ungava Peninsula today. They looked at the same stars, the same sun wheeling low across the horizon in the long Arctic summer, the same darkness that settled over the land in winter and stayed for months. They felt hunger and cold and fear. They felt also, presumably, something that we might call purpose, the sense that what they were doing mattered, that placing this stone on that stone in this place, at this time, was part of something larger than themselves. That sense of purpose is the most human thing about the walls. And it is the thing that most resists explanation, because we cannot know, from 10,000 years of distance, what that purpose was. We can measure the walls, we can photograph them, we can take samples and attempt to date them, we can compare them to other structures in other places and look for similarities and differences. We can debate their origin until we are blue in the face. But we cannot know why. We can only know that there was a why. That someone, in that enormous cold landscape, with that enormous cold sky above them, decided that something needed to be built, and built it, and walked away, and left us the stones. There is a phenomenon in northern Canada that the people of the region have known about for a very long time, and that the scientific community has been somewhat slower to appreciate. It is the phenomenon of emergence, the way in which the retreating permafrost and the processes of erosion and isostatic uplift are constantly bringing new things to the surface that were previously hidden. In warmer years, as the active layer above the permafrost deepens, objects that have been frozen in the ground for thousands of years thaw out and begin to appear, bones of extinct animals, artifacts made of wood and leather and other organic materials that would not survive in other environments, and stones that have shifted as the ground around them moved, that have appeared at the surface in configurations that suggest they were once part of something buried. Northern Canada is a slow-motion archaeological dig that is being conducted by the climate rather than by researchers with trowels. And what it is digging up, year by year, is a record of the past that is only beginning to be recognized and documented. The implications of this are significant. It means that the stone features currently visible in the landscape are a sample of what was once there, and possibly a small sample. Below the surface, frozen into the permafrost, there may be structural elements that have not yet emerged, features that would clarify the relationship between the visible components and reveal the full scale and character of what was built. As the permafrost continues to thaw, which it is doing at an accelerating rate, more will emerge. Some of that material will be documented by researchers who happen to be in the right place at the right time. Some will be destroyed by erosion or disturbance before anyone sees it. The race is on, in a sense, between the climate and the archaeologists. The climate is winning, not because archaeologists are not trying, but because the scale of the territory involved is so vast and the resources available for its study are so limited relative to that scale. And there is another kind of emergence happening simultaneously, an emergence of data and perspective that has nothing to do with the physical landscape. The emergence, in recent years, of a more serious and sustained engagement with indigenous knowledge systems as sources of information about the pre-colonial past. The oral traditions of the Inuit, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, and the many other indigenous peoples of northern Canada contain knowledge about the land and its history that has been transmitted across many generations, and that may preserve accurate information about events that occurred long before any written records existed. When Inuit elders speak of places where the Tuniat lived and worked, they are not speaking from ignorance. They are speaking from a tradition that has maintained continuity of knowledge about the land for a very long time. When Cree knowledge keepers refer to the old ones who built things in the land, they are not referring to mythology in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. They are referring to something their people have always known, that they are not the first people to have lived in and shaped this landscape, and that the evidence of those who came before is written in the land itself. The integration of indigenous knowledge with archaeological investigation is not without its difficulties. There are legitimate concerns about intellectual property, about the appropriation of traditional knowledge by outside researchers, about the way in which indigenous perspectives have historically been distorted or dismissed by Western academic institutions. These concerns are real and deserve serious attention. But when indigenous people share their knowledge about the landscape and its history, and when that knowledge is treated with the same rigor and respect that is accorded to other forms of evidence, it can open up possibilities that conventional archaeological methods alone might not find. The knowledge that there are old things in the landscape of northern Canada, things that predate the current indigenous populations, is itself a form of evidence. It is evidence that the people who have lived in that landscape for a very long time have noticed and remembered something about it. What they have noticed and remembered points toward the same anomaly that the stone features themselves represent, that the human history of northern Canada is older and more complex than the conventional narrative acknowledges. Step back, then, from the specific features and the specific debates and try to see the larger picture. What is the story of northern Canada's human past, as best as we can reconstruct it from all available evidence? It is a story that begins at the very end of the last ice age, when the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet began to open up the interior of the continent to human habitation for the first time in many thousands of years. The people who moved into this newly available landscape came from multiple directions and carried multiple cultural traditions. Some were descending from the north and west, following the caribou and musk ox that colonized the new tundra almost as fast as it emerged from the ice. Some may have come along the coast, following the productive marine ecosystems of the subarctic and Arctic Ocean margins. Some may have already been in the region, in refugia south of the ice sheet, or in coastal areas that had remained ice-free even at the height of the glaciation. These people built what they built, left what they left, and moved when they needed to move. They survived the tremendous environmental changes of the early Holocene, the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes, the shifts in vegetation zones, the changes in the distribution of game animals, the dramatic alterations in coastline and river system. They adapted. Human beings are extraordinarily good at adaptation, which is perhaps the core explanation for why we have populated every habitable environment on the planet. And as they moved through the landscape, some of them left stones behind them. Stones in configurations that spoke of purposes we do not fully understand. Stones in places that suggested knowledge of the sky and the land that we are only beginning to appreciate. Stones that have survived 10,000 years of geological and climatic violence to be still there, still puzzling, still waiting for the right questions. The walls of northern Canada are not a mystery in the sense that they are beyond comprehension. They are a mystery in the sense that we have not yet found the key that fits their lock. The key is out there. It may be in the permafrost, thawing slowly into the light. It may be in the archives of government survey agencies, in field notes that have never been analysed. It may be in the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region, in knowledge that has been shared, but not yet integrated with the archaeological record in a systematic way. It may be in the genetics of living populations, in patterns that have not yet been identified or interpreted. The key is out there, and the work of finding it is urgent, not just because the permafrost is thawing and the landscape is changing in ways that will destroy evidence, but because the story matters. It matters because it is the story of our species, of what we are capable of how far back our history really goes, and of how much we have forgotten about where we came from and who came before us. It matters because the walls are there, built by hands, standing in the cold. Let us spend some time with the archaeology of a specific region, because the generalities, while useful for orienting the mind, can sometimes obscure the specific and particular things that make this subject so compelling. Let us look at the Hudson Strait region, the body of water that separates the Ungava Peninsula from the southern tip of Baffin Island, and at the evidence that has accumulated over the last century from the shores and hinterland of that strait. Hudson Strait is not a gentle piece of water. It is approximately 800 kilometers long and between 60 and 240 kilometers wide, connecting Hudson Bay on the west to the Labrador Sea on the east. The tides in Hudson Strait are among the largest in the world. At certain points along the strait, the tidal range can exceed 10 meters, and the resulting tidal currents are powerful enough to complicate or prevent navigation at certain states of the tide. The strait is ice-covered for much of the year, opening in late summer and closing again in autumn. It is, in short, a genuinely formidable body of water that nonetheless does not prevent human movement, as the Dorset and Thule peoples demonstrated over many centuries of inhabiting both its northern and southern shores. The shoreline of Hudson Strait on both sides preserves a complex archaeological record that includes evidence of multiple cultural periods. Tent rings, house foundations, meat caches, middens rich in faunal remains, and carved stone objects from the Dorset tradition have been documented at numerous locations. Pre-Dorset material is also present, though less extensively documented. But there are also features that do not fit neatly into either the Dorset or pre-Dorset categories. Along the southern shore of the strait, in the region that drains into Ungava Bay, there are elevated coastal terraces that represent old shorelines from periods when the land was at different elevations relative to the sea. On these terraces, sometimes at heights that indicate they were formed thousands of years ago when the land was lower and the sea was therefore relative to the land much higher, there are stone features whose character suggests human construction, but whose dating is problematic. The dating problem is significant. In the absence of organic material preserved in association with the stone features, it is extremely difficult to determine when a given arrangement of stones was created. Stone itself cannot be carbon dated. What can sometimes be dated is the organic material found in or near a feature: shell in a midden associated with a structure, charcoal from a hearth, bone from a refuse deposit. When such material is present and reliably associated with the construction phase of a feature, it provides a date. When it is absent, or when the association between the organic material and the construction is unclear, the dating is uncertain. For many of the anomalous stone features of northern Canada, organic material that could be reliably dated has not been found in secure association with the construction phase. This does not mean the features are undatable in principle. It means they have not yet been dated. The difference is important. An undated feature is a mystery waiting for more data. A feature that has been studied and found to be undatable is a more fundamental problem. Most of the anomalous features fall in the first category, not the second. There have been attempts to use other dating methods. Cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measures the accumulation of isotopes in rock surfaces that have been exposed to cosmic rays, can in principle be applied to the exposed surfaces of stone features, though the method requires careful interpretation in periglacial environments where repeated freeze-thaw cycles can expose surfaces that were previously buried. Optically stimulated luminescence dating can be applied to sediments trapped beneath or adjacent to stone features, measuring the time since those sediments were last exposed to light. These methods are not perfect, but they can provide useful constraints on the age of stone features, even in the absence of datable organic material. The application of these newer dating methods to the anomalous features of northern Canada has been limited and intermittent. There is not a well-funded, systematic research program aimed at dating and interpreting these features. The academic interest in this subject has been present but not sustained, partly because the funding agencies that support archaeological research have not prioritized it, and partly because the very anomalousness of the features makes them targets for the kind of speculation that mainstream researchers prefer to avoid. This is one of the ways in which the sociology of science intersects with the actual science. Researchers who work on genuinely anomalous findings face a set of incentives that can impede progress. If your findings are consistent with established narratives, they are easy to publish and are welcomed by the field. If your findings challenge established narratives, they attract scrutiny, criticism, and sometimes hostility. The response to Thomas Lee's work on the Ungava Peninsula features in the 1960s and 70s included both substantive scientific criticism and what Lee and his supporters described as institutional obstruction. Lee's career suffered, in his own account, because he continued to pursue findings that his colleagues and funders would have preferred he abandon. Whether Lee's claims were ultimately correct is a separate question from whether the treatment of his work was appropriate. But the pattern he describes, of anomalous findings being met with resistance that goes beyond normal scientific skepticism, is recognizable to anyone who has studied the sociology of scientific controversy. Science proceeds more efficiently when anomalies are welcomed rather than suppressed, because anomalies are the places where new understanding emerges. The walls of northern Canada are anomalies. They deserve to be welcomed. There is a broader context for this discussion that should not be ignored, because the mystery of the walls connects to other mysteries in the archaeology of North America, mysteries that have accumulated over the decades, and that together point toward a picture of the pre-Columbian past that is significantly more complex than the one presented in standard textbooks. Consider the Kennewick Man, the skeletal remains found in Washington state in 1996, dated to approximately 9,000 years old, and whose morphology generated intense controversy because it did not match the expected morphology of ancient Native Americans. The Kennewick Man's skull showed characteristics that some researchers described as Caucasoid or Ainu-like, which is to say similar to the indigenous people of Japan and dissimilar to the typical morphology of Native American populations. This finding, which was simultaneously a genuine scientific puzzle and a political flashpoint because of the legal disputes over the remains' ownership, suggested that the earliest Americans may have been a more morphologically diverse group than previously understood, consistent with the genetic evidence for population Y. Consider also the Spirit Cave mummy found in Nevada, dated to about 9,400 years ago, which showed similar morphological characteristics to Kennewick Man, and the Buhl woman of Idaho, approximately 10,500 years old, whose genetic analysis was performed before NAGPRA repatriation requirements were applied, and which generated data that has not been fully interpreted in the context of current knowledge of early American populations. These are not isolated curiosities. They are part of a pattern of evidence suggesting that the earliest human populations of North America were more diverse, more complex, and possibly of more varied geographic origin than the simple Bering land bridge model accommodated. This pattern does not require invoking ancient aliens or lost continents. It requires only acknowledging that human population history is complex, that multiple waves of migration into the Americas were possible, and that the genetic and morphological diversity of early Americans reflects a history of migration and contact that we are only beginning to understand. In the context of this broader pattern, the walls of northern Canada are not an isolated anomaly. They are one more data point in an accumulating body of evidence that the human story in North America did not unfold the way we were taught. Let us also consider the question of what indigenous peoples themselves have said about the walls, beyond the oral traditions already mentioned. There have been indigenous archaeologists and researchers who have approached the anomalous features of northern Canada from perspectives shaped by both Western scientific training and traditional knowledge. Some of these researchers have concluded that the features represent genuine puzzles that deserve more study. Some have offered interpretations grounded in indigenous cosmological frameworks that differ from Western archaeological interpretations, but that are internally consistent and take the features seriously as evidence of past human activity. The Inuit concept of Inua, the spirit or person inhabiting objects and places, offers a framework for understanding why certain locations were chosen for construction. A place with Inua is a place where the boundary between the human and non-human world is thin, where the forces that govern the world are accessible to human engagement. The construction of a stone feature at such a place would be an act of relationship making, a way of marking and reinforcing a connection between the human community and the non-human powers of the landscape. This does not explain the engineering of the walls, but it offers a possible answer to the question of why the walls are where they are. The Cree concept of Manitou, broadly understood as a pervasive spiritual power or presence in the natural world, similarly offers a framework for understanding the locations and character of construction in the landscape. Places where Manitou is concentrated, at the junction of rivers, on prominent hilltops, at the margins of large bodies of water, are places where a human being needs to acknowledge and engage with the non-human order of things. The construction of a stone feature might be one way of doing that acknowledgement. Neither of these frameworks proves anything about who built the walls or when, but they suggest that the question of why is not necessarily unanswerable from the perspective of the cultural traditions of the people who have inhabited northern Canada the longest. The why may be embedded in frameworks of knowledge and relationship that Western archaeology has historically been poorly equipped to recognize. There is a moment in reading the scattered literature on the anomalous stone features of northern Canada when the full weight of what we do not know suddenly becomes apparent. It is a disorienting moment, the kind of vertigo that comes from realizing that a landscape you thought you understood is actually largely unknown. North America, particularly the northern part of the continent, has been the subject of enormous amounts of research in geology, ecology, biology, geography, and many other disciplines. The land has been mapped and measured and analyzed in extraordinary detail. And yet, the human dimension of that landscape, the story of who lived there, and what they did, and what they built, and what they believed, is fragmentary, contested, and in important respects, simply unknown. The walls are a reminder of that unknowing. They are a reminder that the land holds more history than we have managed to extract from it, and that the extraction of that history is a project that has barely begun. What would it take to make real progress on this mystery? It would take sustained, well-funded, interdisciplinary fieldwork in some of the most remote and inhospitable territory on the continent. It would take the application of the full range of modern dating and analytical techniques to the specific features that have been identified. It would take genuine collaboration between Western-trained archaeologists and indigenous knowledge keepers, the kind of collaboration that is built on mutual respect and a willingness to take seriously forms of evidence and ways of knowing that fall outside the conventional academic toolkit. It would also take a degree of intellectual courage, because the findings that emerge from such investigation might be deeply uncomfortable for established narratives. They might require substantial revision of what we think we know about the peopling of the Americas, about the social complexity of Arctic hunter-gatherers, about the age and character of the human occupation of northern Canada. Scientific institutions do not always respond well to the need for substantial revision. The resistance that Thomas Lee encountered in the 1960s and 70s was real, and the dynamics that produced that resistance have not disappeared from the culture of academic archaeology. But the discomfort of revision is temporary. The understanding that comes from taking anomalies seriously is permanent, and the walls, whatever their origin, deserve the serious, sustained, collaborative investigation that might finally tell us what they are and who built them and why. They deserve it not because the mystery is compelling, though it is. They deserve it because the full story of what happened in northern Canada before the arrival of Europeans is part of the full story of what it means to be human. Because the people who built those walls, whoever they were human beings with purposes and beliefs and the determination to leave a mark on the landscape. And their story, however partial and fragmentary and difficult to recover, is our story too. It is the story of our species, exploring and settling and building in every corner of a vast and difficult world. It is the story of human resilience and human curiosity and human ingenuity applied to the problem of living in a place that does not make living easy. It is a story worth knowing. The wind still moves across the tundra of northern Quebec. The stones still sit on the ridgelines above Paine Lake. The permafrost still holds its secrets, slowly releasing them as the climate changes. The indigenous peoples of the region still carry in their traditions and their bodies the echoes of everything that happened on their land before the written record began. The researchers who have devoted careers to understanding these places still write and argue and wonder, and somewhere in that landscape, built into the ancient rock of the Canadian Shield, the walls still stand, patient and cold, and full of questions that we have not yet learned to ask in the right way. They are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. Let us look now at the character of the ancient landscape in a more granular way, because the landscape itself is evidence, and reading it carefully can suggest things that the archaeological record, fragmentary as it is, does not make explicit. The Canadian Shield, the ancient crystalline bedrock that underlies much of northern Canada, is one of the most stable geological features on the planet. The rock itself is billions of years old, among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth. It has survived everything: continental collisions, ocean openings, glaciation upon glaciation, the entire sweep of complex life on this planet. It does not change on any human timescale. The features carved or built into it, unless actively destroyed, will persist essentially indefinitely. This is one reason why the stone walls and enclosures of northern Canada are still visible. If they had been built of wood, or bone, or hide, they would be gone. The organic materials of the Arctic, however well preserved they sometimes are in permafrost, are not stable over 10,000 years unless they are frozen continuously and are not exposed to the processes of thaw and refreeze. But stone is different. Stone, placed deliberately in the landscape, remains where it was placed unless something physically moves it. Glaciation, dramatic slope failure, deliberate destruction. In the absence of those forces, the stone stays. And so the question of what built the walls becomes partly a question of what has not disturbed them since they were built. The fact that they are still there implies that no subsequent glaciation overrode them, which provides a minimum age. They must postdate the last glaciation of their specific locations. In some cases, this pushes the possible construction date back further than one might expect, because the deglaciation of different parts of northern Canada happened at different times, and the last local ice lingered in some areas much longer than in others. The Quebec-Labrador Peninsula, where some of the most anomalous features are located, had its last local ice, the Labrador Dome of the Laurentide ice sheet, only disappear around 6,000 years ago in its central and most elevated parts. This means that the interior of the Ungava Peninsula was uninhabitable, covered by ice, until relatively recently. The features on the Ungava Peninsula, therefore, cannot predate about 6,000 years ago for the interior locations, which actually helps constrain the dating problem. The features are almost certainly less than 6,000 years old if they are in the interior, or they are in coastal areas that deglaciated earlier. But the coastal areas of the Ungava Peninsula deglaciated substantially earlier than the interior, with ice retreating from the coasts, beginning around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Coastal sites in the region could therefore be as much as 9,000 years old, which is old enough to predate the Arctic small tool tradition and the pre-Dorset, pushing us into a period that is genuinely poorly understood in terms of human occupation. There is also the question of what the environment looked like when the construction happened. Today, the Ungava Peninsula is treeless tundra, open country with low vegetation and vast areas of bare rock. But it was not always like this. Following the retreat of the ice, the landscape went through a series of ecological transitions. Initially, it was barren glacial outwash and exposed rock, essentially devoid of vegetation. Then pioneer species began to colonize. Mosses and sedges and dwarf willows and other low plants adapted to harsh conditions. Over centuries, these gave way to a more productive tundra ecosystem, and in some areas, further south, to the boreal forest edge. At certain periods in the past, the tree line in northern Quebec was actually further north than it is today. During the Holocene thermal maximum, roughly between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, when temperatures in the northern hemisphere were somewhat warmer than they are now due to the particular configuration of the Earth's orbit, forests extended further north, and the productivity of the northern landscape was higher than it currently is. If human populations were building structures in this region during the Holocene thermal maximum, they would have been doing so in a more productive environment than the one that exists today, with more available resources and potentially larger and more stable population groups. A more productive environment means more people. More people means more social complexity. More social complexity means more investment in permanent infrastructure. The walls, if they were built during the Holocene thermal maximum, might reflect a period when northern Quebec supported a larger and more organized human population than the sparse and mobile bands that the conventional narrative envisions. This is consistent with the broader pattern of what is being found in the archaeology of the Arctic and subarctic when it is looked at carefully. The assumption that these regions were always barely inhabited, that they represent the limits of human habitation where only tiny, struggling populations manage to scratch out a living, does not match the actual evidence of human capability and adaptability. The Dorset, as noted, maintained a sophisticated and consistent culture across a vast territory for 2,000 years. The tool expanded across the entire eastern Arctic in a few centuries, organizing enough social and economic power to hunt bowhead whales. The modern Inuit survived for centuries in conditions that would be fatal to anyone not deeply adapted to the environment. The people of 10,000 years ago were the same species, with the same brain, the same social capabilities, the same fundamental intelligence and adaptability. There is no reason to assume they were less capable of organizing complex societies than the Dorset or the Thule. There is every reason to ask whether the evidence of their complexity is simply less visible because it is older and more difficult to find. Let us revisit the question of what we might call architectural intentionality, the way in which the design of a structure reveals the capabilities and purposes of its builders. When archaeologists analyze ancient buildings, they look for evidence of planning, the selection of appropriate materials, the preparation of the site, the execution of a consistent design across multiple structural elements, the orientation of the structure relative to the landscape and the sky. These things tell you about the mind behind the construction, about the level of organization and knowledge that the builders brought to their work. The anomalous stone features of northern Canada show, where they have been carefully examined, characteristics consistent with architectural intentionality. The selection of building stone, not just any available rock, but specific types and sizes of stone, suitable for stable construction. The preparation of building sites, the clearing or leveling of ground where necessary. The consistent orientation of structures across a given site, suggesting that orientation was a conscious decision rather than a result of following the path of least resistance. The relationship between individual structures, at sites where multiple features are present, relationships that suggest the features were planned as a group rather than built independently over time. These characteristics are not what you find in natural stone formations. Natural formations do not select for specific stone types or sizes. Natural formations do not orient consistently relative to astronomical events. Natural formations do not show internal organization that suggests planning. The walls were planned. They were built by minds that understood what they were doing and had reasons for doing it in the specific way they did. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to when the details of dating and attribution and cultural sequence begin to blur. Whatever else is uncertain, the intentionality is not. There is a kind of comfort in the stones. Not the comfort of easy answers, but the comfort of knowing that the questions are real. The walls are there. The mystery is genuine. And somewhere in the deep past of northern Canada, there were people who mattered, who built and believed and lived in a landscape that is still there, still cold, still largely unknown. Their work survives them by 10,000 years. That is a kind of immortality. There is a name that almost never appears in mainstream accounts of North American prehistory, but that deserves significant attention in any honest discussion of who may have inhabited northern Canada before the conventionally recognized cultures arrived. That name, or rather that designation, is the maritime archaic tradition. And the maritime archaic people, sometimes called the red paint people because of their extensive use of red ochre in burial ceremonies, were one of the most sophisticated prehistoric cultures of the northern Atlantic coast, and they have been systematically underestimated. For most of the time, they have been known to archaeology. The maritime archaic tradition developed along the Atlantic coast of North America beginning roughly 9,000 years ago, and lasted in some form until around 3,500 years ago. At their height, maritime archaic people occupied the coast from Labrador and Newfoundland, south to Maine, and possibly further. They were supremely accomplished maritime hunters and fishers, using sophisticated watercraft and equipment to pursue swordfish, harp seals, walrus, and great auk, among many other species. Their technology was complex and varied, reflecting a deep and detailed knowledge of the marine environment and its resources. The burial sites of the maritime archaic are among the most remarkable in North American archaeology. At Port O'Shoy in Newfoundland, excavated beginning in the 1960s, maritime archaic burials were found that contained an extraordinary array of grave goods, tools, and ornaments made from bone, antler, and stone, elaborate assemblages of red ochre that gave the culture one of its popular names, and evidence of ritual practices that implied a complex spiritual worldview. The oldest confirmed maritime archaic burials at Port O'Shoy date to around 3,400 years ago, but the tradition itself is much older, and there are maritime archaic sites in Labrador and elsewhere that have been dated to 7,000 years ago or more. What did the maritime archaic build? This is a question to which the answer is not fully known, partly because maritime archaic sites were primarily coastal, and many of them are now underwater, drowned by the same post-glacial sea level rise that submerged the coastal evidence of other early cultures around the world. What survives on land suggests that they were capable of substantial constructions, including burial mounds, ceremonial structures, and possibly habitation features more permanent than simple tent rings. The full extent of their construction capabilities is not known because the most productive environments for their culture, the coast, are now inaccessible. The maritime archaic people were in the Hudson Strait region. They were in Labrador. The relationship between their territory and the Ungava Peninsula, just across the strait from their Labrador homeland, is not fully understood, but it is not impossible that maritime archaic people, or people in a cultural tradition closely related to theirs, were on the Ungava Peninsula and the shores of Hudson Bay at some point during their existence. If maritime archaic people were on the Ungava Peninsula, they would have had the technology, the social organization, and the cultural motivation to build substantial stone features. They built elaborate burial structures. They organized complex hunting expeditions that required sustained coordination. They maintained long-distance trade networks that extended from Labrador to the Great Lakes. These are the capabilities of a culture with genuine social complexity, a culture that could plan and execute projects beyond the immediate needs of subsistence. Could the maritime archaic have built the walls of northern Canada? Possibly. The timing is roughly right for some of the features that might date to the period between 7,000 and 3,000 years ago. The geographic range of the maritime archaic overlaps with the region where the features have been found. The cultural capabilities of the maritime archaic are consistent with what would be required to build the features, but there is a significant gap in the evidence. The maritime archaic material culture, as currently understood, does not include features comparable to the extended stone walls of the Ungava Peninsula and Baffin Island. The maritime archaic are known for their burial practices, their tool technologies, their maritime adaptations. They are not known for building long walls. This may reflect a real absence of wall building from their repertoire, or it may reflect the fact that the maritime archaic sites that have been excavated are predominantly burial sites and campsites, rather than the kinds of locations where large-scale construction would have occurred. The archaeology of the maritime archaic, like the archaeology of most pre-Columbian cultures, is biased toward the kinds of sites that have been found and excavated. The distribution of known sites does not necessarily reflect the distribution of past occupation. It reflects the distribution of past archaeological investigation, which is shaped by factors including accessibility, funding, research priorities, and happenstance. There is one more ancient culture of northern Canada that deserves mention, because it has been largely overlooked in standard accounts, and because the evidence for its existence points toward a level of pre-Columbian complexity in northern North America that challenges conventional assumptions. This is what some researchers have called the Shield Archaic tradition, a set of archaeological cultures that occupied the boreal forest and tundra regions of the Canadian interior from roughly 7,000 to 2,000 years ago. The Shield Archaic is poorly understood, partly because the interior of the Canadian Shield is one of the most archaeologically understudied regions in North America. The acidic soils of the boreal forest destroy bone and other organic materials rapidly, and the archaeology of the Shield Archaic is known primarily from stone tools, which tell you about technology but relatively little about social organization, beliefs, or construction practices. The Shield Archaic people were clearly present across an enormous territory, from Ontario and Quebec in the east to the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border in the west, and in some areas, extending well north of the current tree line onto the tundra. Their relationship to the Maritime Archaic, to the pre-Dorset, and to other contemporary cultures is not fully understood, but there is evidence of interaction and influence among these groups. Trade materials from the coast have been found at Shield Archaic sites, hundreds of kilometers inland. Shield Archaic tool types appear at sites that are otherwise associated with coastal cultures. The boundaries between these cultural traditions were not absolute, and the people who lived in these regions were not isolated from each other. If the Shield Archaic people, or their contemporaries, built stone structures in the interior of the Canadian Shield, those structures might be what we are now calling the anomalous stone features of northern Canada. The Shield Archaic people were in the right place at the right time, with sufficient cultural complexity and territorial organization to have motivated substantial construction. Their sites, where they can be found, show evidence of sustained occupation and of the kind of social investment in particular places that would motivate construction. But again, the specific connection between the Shield Archaic and the anomalous stone features has not been demonstrated. It is a hypothesis consistent with available evidence, not a conclusion supported by direct evidence. The work required to test this hypothesis has not been done. And perhaps that is the most fundamental statement that can be made about the mystery of the walls of northern Canada. The work required to answer the questions has not been done. Not because the questions are unanswerable, not because the evidence is irretrievably lost, but because the academic, institutional, and funding structures of North American archaeology have not prioritized this particular set of questions in the way that would be required to make real progress. This is beginning to change. The convergence of several factors is pushing northern Canadian archaeology in new directions. The development of new dating and analytical techniques is making it possible to extract information from sites and materials that were previously intractable. The growing recognition of the value of Indigenous knowledge is opening up new avenues of investigation that were previously overlooked. The rapidly changing Arctic environment, while creating new threats to the archaeological record, is also exposing new sites and features that were previously buried or inaccessible. And the growing public interest in the deep past of North America, reflected in part in conversations like this one, is creating demand for better answers to questions that have been set aside for too long. Progress will be slow, it will be contested, it will not proceed in a straight line from mystery to resolution, but it will happen. And when it does, the story that emerges will be richer, more complex, and more wonderful than the simplified narrative it replaces. The people of northern Canada, 10,000 years ago, deserve to be known. The walls they may have built deserve to be understood. And we, as their distant inheritors of the same species and the same broad human project, deserve to know their story. We have been circling the question of what the walls mean to the people who live in the region today. The Inuit and Cree and Naskapi and Montagnais and the other Indigenous nations of northern Canada. And it would be wrong to move through this subject without dwelling there for a while, because the living relationship between northern Canada's Indigenous peoples and the ancient landscapes they inhabit is itself a form of evidence, a form of knowledge, that bears directly on the mystery. The Inuit have a relationship with the land that defies easy description in Western terms. It is not simply that they live on the land, or that they depend on it for subsistence. The land is, in a sense, that is literal within Inuit understanding, alive with presences and relationships that extend far into the past. The notion that a landscape can hold memory, that places can carry the accumulated weight of everything that has happened in them, is not metaphorical for Inuit. It is a description of how the world works. When an Inuit elder says that a particular place is old, or that a particular feature in the landscape is the work of beings who came before, they are not expressing ignorance of natural processes or falling back on mythology. They are drawing on a system of knowledge, that has been refined over many generations of close, attentive engagement with the land. That system has been extraordinarily successful at maintaining human survival in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. It deserves to be taken seriously as a source of information about the past. The Inuit knowledge of stone features in the Arctic is extensive and nuanced. They distinguish between Inuksut that they themselves built or that their ancestors built, features associated with Tuniat occupation that predate Inuit arrival, and features that belong to a category sometimes translated as the work of the very old ones, an even earlier presence in the landscape that even the Dorset did not build. This three-level classification is consistent across different Inuit communities in the Eastern Arctic, suggesting that it reflects a genuine and long-standing tradition of distinguishing between different ages and origins of stone features in the landscape. The features attributed to the very old ones in this indigenous classification system are described as larger, more elaborate, and in locations that do not correspond to the practical needs of either Inuit or Dorset occupation patterns. They are described as belonging to a time before the current pattern of seasons, a time when the world was different in ways that defy specific description, because the traditions that would have preserved those descriptions have been lost or corrupted over the vast span of time since the very old ones lived. This indigenous knowledge does not identify who the very old ones were, but it confirms, from a completely independent direction, that the stone features of some antiquity are recognized as different in kind and origin from the features of more recent periods. The Cree of the Hudson Bay watershed have parallel traditions. The Cree homeland in interior Quebec and Ontario is separated from the Ungava Peninsula by the subarctic forest, but the Cree have knowledge of the Ungava region through generations of travel and through the trade and communication networks that connected different indigenous peoples of the north. Cree traditions about the northern landscape include references to structures built by beings who are described not as humans, but as something adjacent to human, as a category of being that shared the world with humans during an earlier age and then departed. This is the kind of tradition that, in the hands of less careful interpreters, gets quickly converted into evidence for ancient aliens or pre-human civilizations. It is important to resist that conversion, not because the traditions are unimportant or untrustworthy, but because converting them too quickly into support for a specific exotic theory does disservice to both the traditions themselves and to the genuine mystery they point toward. Indigenous oral traditions are complex, multi-layered documents whose interpretation requires the same care and contextual knowledge that any complex historical document requires. Reading them as literal descriptions of events is often as misleading as dismissing them as pure myth. What the Cree traditions suggest, taken carefully and in context, is that there is awareness of a pre-Cree human presence in the northern landscape, a presence that was significant enough to be remembered across many generations, that built things in the land, and that belongs to a period far enough in the past that its nature and origin are genuinely uncertain, even to the traditions that remember it. This is not a story about non-human beings in any science fiction sense. It is a story about how deep human memory of this landscape reaches, and about how complex the human history of the region truly is. Let us now consider, carefully and without sensationalism, the possibility that has been most systematically excluded from mainstream accounts. The possibility that the builders of the northern Canadian stone features had connections to, or were themselves part of, a cultural tradition that included people from across the Atlantic or Pacific. This is not the same as the ancient alien hypothesis, and conflating the two is a serious intellectual error. The question of whether pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and North America included contacts that affected the interior of the continent, including northern Canada, is a legitimate historical and archaeological question that deserves serious analysis. The Norse evidence, as noted, is solid. Lanceor Meadows demonstrates Norse presence in Newfoundland around 1000 CE, but the Norse were not the first Old World people to know about the Western Atlantic. The Basque fishermen, who worked the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in the centuries before Columbus left behind evidence of a substantial fishing industry in the region, including the well-documented Basque whaling station at Red Bay in Labrador, which has been dated to the 16th century, How much earlier Basque or other European fishermen were in the region is genuinely uncertain. More interesting for our purposes is the question of pre-Viking contacts. There is a substantial body of evidence, some of it quite compelling, for contact between North America and the Old World in the centuries before the Norse expansion. The evidence includes unusual plant species found in North America that appear to be of Old World origin and predating Columbus, certain artistic and architectural motifs that appear on both sides of the Atlantic, and a number of claims for the presence of Old World languages or writing systems in North American contexts. Most of these claims are contested, and many are probably wrong. The history of pre-Columbian contact claims is littered with wishful thinking, misidentification, and outright fraud. The academic community's skepticism of such claims is not baseless, but the existence of real, documented cases of pre-Columbian contact, specifically the Norse case, means that the hypothesis of earlier or wider contact cannot simply be dismissed a priori. It must be evaluated on the merits of the specific evidence in each case. For northern Canada specifically, the question is whether any of the anomalous stone features show characteristics that would suggest construction by people with Old World architectural traditions. This is an empirical question, one that could in principle be answered by detailed comparative analysis of the construction techniques visible in the features. Such analysis has not been systematically conducted. In the absence of that analysis, the hypothesis of Old World contact as an explanation for the features is neither confirmed nor refuted. It is simply not yet examined. What can be said is that the scale and character of the stone construction in the most elaborate of the northern Canadian features is not inconsistent with construction traditions that are known from the Old World in the period of roughly 5 to 10,000 years ago. The megalithic building traditions of Atlantic Europe, which produce structures like the passage tombs of Ireland and Brittany, the long barrows of England, and the stone circles of the British Isles and Brittany, operated in a similar range of stone construction techniques and produced structures of comparable scale. If Old World people with a megalithic tradition were in northern Canada at some point in the relevant period, the features they might have built would look something like what has been found. This is not a claim. It is an observation about what would be expected if a specific hypothesis were true. The hypothesis itself requires much more evidence before it can be taken seriously as an explanation, but closing off the possibility a priori, without examining it, is not science. It is the defense of a narrative. Let us turn our attention now to the ocean. The North Atlantic, in the context of ancient human movement, is often treated as an impassable barrier, the empty void between the Old World and the New. This treatment is historically inaccurate and geographically naive. The North Atlantic is not an empty void. It is an ocean with a specific structure, with currents and wind patterns and island chains and seasonal ice that create pathways and barriers that differ from the simplistic image of a featureless expanse of water. The North Atlantic Gyre, the great circular current system of the North Atlantic, creates conditions along its northern margins, in the region of Iceland and Greenland and the eastern Canadian Arctic, that are quite different from the open ocean conditions further south. The Davis Strait, separating Baffin Island from Greenland, is a narrow enough body of water that, in favourable conditions, it would present no fundamental challenge to people capable of building the skin boats that the Dorset and Thule traditions are known to have used. The distance from Greenland to Baffin Island, at the shortest crossing, is roughly 300 kilometres. In the summer, when ice conditions permit, this is a crossing that could be accomplished in a few days by a competent crew in a capable boat. Iceland and Greenland are themselves stepping stones that reduce the oceanic crossing between northern Europe and North America to a series of manageable legs, rather than a single enormous traverse. The Norse used exactly these stepping stones for their westward expansion. The question is not whether the North Atlantic could be crossed before the Norse. The question is whether it was crossed, and whether the people who crossed it left evidence of their presence in the Western Atlantic. The Faroe Islands were settled by Irish monks before the Norse arrived, and there is evidence of pre-Viking presence on Iceland as well. The Norse sagas describe finding Irish monks already in Greenland when they arrived, though this is a detail of uncertain historicity. The sea routes of the North Atlantic were used by Celtic maritime peoples in the early medieval period in ways that have been substantially underestimated. The Irish navigational tradition, preserved in texts like the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, The Voyage of Street. Brendan describes a westward Atlantic journey that some researchers have interpreted as a genuine account of a voyage to North America, though most historians treat it as an allegory or legend. What is certain is that the maritime capabilities of the peoples of Atlantic Europe in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, the periods from which the megalithic stone-building traditions emerged, were greater than is often assumed. The construction of the megalithic monuments themselves required the transportation of very large stones over significant distances, sometimes including water crossings. The builders of Stonehenge transported enormous bluestones from Wales to Salisbury Plain, a journey of more than 300 kilometers that required either overland transport across difficult terrain or a coastal and river route involving sea travel. The builders of the megalithic tombs of Brittany transported stone from quarries that required the use of boats on coastal waters. These are not people who were afraid of the sea. If the people of Atlantic Europe in the Neolithic period were capable of maritime travel along their own coasts, and if the North Atlantic stepping stone route to the Western Atlantic was at least hypothetically accessible from Northern Europe, then the possibility of pre-Columbian contact between the megalith-building cultures of Atlantic Europe and the coasts of North America cannot be dismissed on grounds of maritime capability alone. The question is one of evidence, and the evidence is ambiguous. For the specific case of northern Canada, the hypothesis of Old World contact as an explanation for the anomalous stone features would require us to propose that people with Old World cultural traditions were not merely touching the coast of North America, but penetrating substantially into the interior, to the shores of Payne Lake and the ridges of the Ungava Peninsula and the interior of Baffin Island. That is a much larger claim than coastal contact alone, and it requires much more explanation. Why would Old World visitors go inland? What would draw them hundreds of kilometers from the coast into terrain that, however productive in some seasons, is genuinely harsh? The answer to this question, if there is one, may lie in the resources that the interior of northern Canada offered to people with specific cultural needs. Certain stone types, including the quartzite and chert that are found in abundance on the Canadian Shield, are excellent raw materials for stone tool manufacture. The caribou that migrate through the interior of the Ungava Peninsula in enormous herds during spring and fall are an extraordinary resource for any culture dependent on large mammals. The fishing in the rivers and lakes of the interior during the brief but incredibly productive Arctic summer is potentially capable of supporting large groups for significant periods. If Old World people were in the region for any of these resources, or for resources we have not thought of, or for reasons that were cultural or ritual rather than economic, they might have built the kinds of stone features that have been found. But this chain of reasoning is very long, and each link requires evidence that does not currently exist. It is a hypothesis worthy of examination, not a conclusion warranted by what we know. Let us return from speculation to observation. Let us talk about what recent surveys using modern technology have found in the landscape of northern Canada, because the picture being assembled by satellite imagery, aerial photography, and ground-penetrating radar is more interesting and more detailed than anything available to the researchers who first grappled with these questions in the 1960s and 70s. Remote sensing technologies have transformed archaeology in the last 20 years. The ability to examine vast areas of terrain from above, to penetrate surface vegetation and see patterns in the ground below, to detect the subtle changes in surface moisture and soil chemistry that indicate the presence of buried structures, has opened up possibilities for archaeological survey that simply did not exist before. In the Old World, these technologies have revolutionized our understanding of the density and distribution of ancient structures in regions like the Amazon basin, the jungles of Cambodia, and the deserts of the Middle East. The same technologies are now being applied with increasing frequency and sophistication to northern Canada. What they are finding is remarkable. Systematic LiDAR surveys of portions of northern Quebec and Baffin Island, conducted in the last decade as part of resource and environmental assessment programs, have identified stone features at densities that substantially exceed what was previously documented by ground survey. The features identified from the air include not only the kinds of structures that were already known, but also new classes of features whose character and distribution are not yet fully understood. Some of these features are large enough that they were presumably visible to anyone who flew over the region in earlier decades, but they were not recognized as archaeological objects because no one was looking for them in that context. The ground-penetrating radar surveys of some sites have detected buried structural elements beneath the surface, features that are not visible from above, but that appear in the subsurface data as regular, linear, human-scale anomalies. These buried features extend the scale of some of the sites that were previously thought to consist only of surface structures, suggesting that the visible components are the tips of complexes that extend substantially below ground. This is exciting, and it is also methodologically challenging. Ground-penetrating radar can detect anomalies in the subsurface, but interpreting those anomalies as specific types of features requires ground truthing, actual excavation, or at minimum coring, to confirm what the radar is detecting. That ground truthing has not been done at most of the sites where subsurface features have been detected from the air. The detected features are real anomalies, but what they represent is not yet known. The satellite imagery analysis of northern Canada has also revealed something interesting at a larger scale: the spatial organization of the surface features, when viewed from above and across a large area, shows patterns that suggest the features were not randomly distributed across the landscape, but were placed in relationship to topographic and hydrological features in consistent and predictable ways. The features cluster near lake shores and river junctions. They occur preferentially on elevated ground, with broad views of the surrounding landscape. They are almost entirely absent from low, poorly drained ground. These patterns are consistent with deliberate site selection by people who understood the landscape and had specific criteria for where to build. Natural stone formations, by contrast, do not show the kind of consistent relationship to topographic features that characterizes the anomalous stone features. Natural formations are shaped by geological processes that do not select for elevated positions with broad views or for proximity to water bodies in the specific way that the archaeological features show. The spatial patterning of the features is therefore itself a form of evidence for their human origin. There is another dimension of the remote sensing evidence that deserves mention. The distribution of surface features, when mapped at the regional scale, shows some regularities that might be interpreted as territorial organization. The features appear to be distributed in clusters that are separated from each other by distances that might represent territorial boundaries between different groups, with the open ground between clusters serving as buffer zones or shared hunting territory. This interpretation is speculative, and the apparent clustering could reflect other factors, including survey completeness and geologic conditions, rather than cultural boundaries. But if the interpretation of territorial organization is correct, it would imply that the builders of the features were organized at a regional scale, that their social complexity extended beyond the individual group to encompass relationships and boundaries between groups across a territory of substantial extent. Territorial organization at that scale is not what we expect from simple, small-scale hunter-gatherers. It is what we expect from groups with stable resource bases, with investment in specific territories, and with the social and political mechanisms to define and defend those territories. It is what we expect, in short, from people considerably more complex in their social organization than the conventional narrative of the period allows. We have talked extensively about the physical evidence, the walls, the features, the remote sensing data, the oral traditions. Let us now think about what was happening in the rest of the world at the time when these features may have been built, because context matters enormously in understanding what was possible. 10,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, something remarkable was happening in the Middle East. The agricultural revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, and the development of settled farming communities was getting underway in the Fertile Crescent. Göbekli Tepe, as noted, was already several thousand years old. The transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to agricultural lifestyles was beginning in parts of what is now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, a transition that would eventually spread across the Old World and transform human civilization. But in the Americas, that transition was happening on a different timeline and in different ways. In Mesoamerica, the domestication of maize was beginning around 9,000 years ago, though it would be several more thousand years before truly agricultural civilizations emerged. In the Andes, the domestication of potatoes and other tubers was also underway. In North America, The transition was even slower, with domestication and intensive cultivation emerging in some regions only within the last few thousand years, and not at all in others. This different timeline is often cited as evidence that the Americas were culturally behind the Old World. But this interpretation misunderstands what was happening. The Americas were not behind. They were on a different trajectory, shaped by different environments, different plant and animal species, and different historical circumstances. The cultures of pre-Columbian North America were not primitive versions of Old World cultures at an earlier stage of development. They were fully realized human cultures, adapted to their specific environments, with their own forms of social complexity, their own intellectual and spiritual traditions, and their own approaches to the fundamental human challenges of organizing societies, understanding the world, and building relationships with the non-human environment. The hunter-gatherer cultures of northern Canada 10,000 years ago were not primitive. They were sophisticated, adapted, and capable of far more than the conventional narrative credits them with. The evidence of Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that hunter-gatherers elsewhere in the world, at roughly the same period, were capable of organizing the construction of massive stone monuments. The evidence of the Monteverde site in Chile demonstrates that people in the Americas were adapting to and exploiting diverse environments at that period with considerable sophistication. The evidence, however fragmentary, of complex constructions in northern Canada is consistent with this broader picture of human capability in the period following the end of the last ice age. What we are looking at when we look at the walls of northern Canada may be precisely the kind of thing that Göbekli Tepe represents in the Old World. The evidence of hunter-gatherer social complexity, of ceremonial and territorial investment by people whose economic lives were not anchored in agriculture, but whose social and spiritual lives were as rich and complex as those of any subsequent civilization. This reframing is important. The walls are not anomalous because they represent a level of capability that should not have existed in hunter-gatherer societies. They are anomalous only because we have underestimated what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of. The revision we need is not a revision of our picture of the remote past. It is a revision of our picture of what human beings are capable of when they are not measuring their civilization by the yardstick of the industrial age. Let us spend a moment thinking about stone itself, about what it meant for the people who worked it, who placed it deliberately in the landscape, who chose it as their medium for expressing whatever they needed to express. Stone is the most permanent of building materials. It outlasts wood, bone, hide, earth. It is the medium of choice when you want what you are building to persist, when you want future generations, however distant, to be able to see and touch what you have made. The choice of stone implies an intention to be remembered. The builders of the northern Canadian walls knew they were building something that would last. They knew, because they lived in close relationship with the ancient rock around them, that stone placed carefully on stone would be there long after they were gone. They were making a statement about their presence in the landscape, a statement intended not for contemporaries who could simply walk to the site and see it, but for people they could not know and could not anticipate, people who would come to this place in some future whose character they could not imagine. We are those people. We are the ones who came to this place in the future they could not imagine. And the message in the stone, however difficult it is to decode, is essentially the same message that all monument builders across all of human history have been sending. We were here. We were real. We built something that mattered. Remember us. The forgetting of the builders of northern Canada's anomalous stone features is not a deliberate erasure, not a conspiracy of silence maintained by gatekeepers of official history. It is simply the natural consequence of what happens when a culture does not write, when the evidence of its existence is limited to the most durable of materials, when the landscape it occupied has been subjected to geological and ecological changes that erased most of the traces it left. The forgetting is as much a product of time and physics as of any human choice. But the forgetting has been aided by a kind of intellectual inertia, a reluctance to look too hard at things that challenge comfortable narratives. This inertia is not malicious. It is the natural response of a scientific community that has limited resources and must prioritize investigations that seem most likely to yield reliable results. Investigating anomalous features in remote locations, features whose significance is unclear and whose dating is problematic, is a risky investment of time and funding for researchers who need to produce publishable results to advance their careers. The incentive structure of academic research does not reward the pursuit of mysteries that might turn out to be misidentifications or might yield results too controversial to publish easily. This is changing slowly. The growing recognition that the early human occupation of the Americas was more complex and diverse than Clovis first assumed has created more intellectual space for anomalous findings. The growing respect for indigenous knowledge as a form of historical evidence has opened new avenues of investigation. The development of new dating techniques and remote sensing technologies has made it more feasible to study remote and difficult sites. And the growing public interest in the deep past of North America, reflected in the success of popular books and documentaries on these subjects, has created some pressure on academic institutions to take the questions more seriously. Progress is being made. It is slow, and it is not linear, and it is frequently contested. But the questions are being asked more systematically than before, and the answers, when they come, will reshape our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Now let us address something that often hovers at the edge of these discussions, something that deserves to be addressed directly and honestly rather than danced around. The question of ancient alien involvement, or of a lost advanced civilization that preceded all known cultures, is a hypothesis that many people find compelling and that the mainstream archaeological community dismisses without much serious engagement. The dismissal is usually justified on empirical grounds. There is no physical evidence of alien technology or of a lost advanced civilization at the level of sophistication that these hypotheses typically require. No advanced metal tools, no evidence of powered machinery or electronics, no written records in recognizable or decipherable form that describe such a civilization. The stone features that are cited as evidence for these hypotheses are not beyond the capabilities of the human cultures known to have been in the regions where they are found. This is a fair empirical argument. The physical evidence does not require extraordinary explanations. The conventional toolkit of human capability, applied by motivated and organized people over sufficient time, is adequate to explain the construction of any stone feature found in northern Canada. Invoking alien or antediluvian assistance is therefore an unnecessary multiplication of entities, a violation of the methodological principle of parsimony that guides good scientific inference. But the dismissal of these hypotheses is sometimes too quick, and for an ironic reason. The mainstream position that dismisses ancient alien theories has sometimes been too conservative, not too liberal, too reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of human capability in the remote past. The ancient alien hypothesis and the conventional narrative of simple, limited prehistoric cultures share a common assumption that the people of the deep past were not capable of organizing and executing complex projects by themselves. The ancient alien theorist concludes from this assumption that alien help was therefore required. The mainstream archaeologist concludes that the features are therefore not as elaborate as they appear, or are natural, or belong to a later period. Both are wrong in the same fundamental way, by underestimating the people of the past. The correct response to the mystery of the northern Canadian walls is neither to invoke alien builders nor to deny the anomaly. The correct response is to take the anomaly seriously as evidence of human capabilities that our current models do not adequately account for, and to invest the research effort required to understand those capabilities better. That is the scientific path. It is less dramatic than either of the alternatives, but it leads to genuine understanding rather than comfortable fantasy in either direction. Let us think about what a fully adequate investigation of the northern Canadian stone features would look like. It would begin with a systematic survey of all known features, using the full range of modern remote sensing and ground survey techniques to create a comprehensive map of the distribution, character, and condition of features across the relevant region. This survey does not currently exist. The features have been documented piecemeal by different researchers using different methods at different times, without any coordinated effort to create a unified picture. With a comprehensive survey in hand, the next step would be a prioritized dating program, applying every available dating technique to a sample of features carefully selected to represent the full range of types and locations. Cosmogenic nuclide dating, optically stimulated luminescence, radiocarbon dating of any associated organic material, and paleomagnetic dating, where applicable, The goal would be to establish, for the first time, a reliable chronology for the features, answering the question of when they were built with the precision that modern science is capable of achieving. Simultaneously, detailed architectural analysis of the most elaborate features would be needed, documenting the specific construction techniques visible in the stone, the selection and preparation of building materials, the spatial relationships within and between features, and the orientations relative to topographic and astronomical reference points. This analysis would support comparison with known architectural traditions from other periods and regions, potentially identifying parallels that could point toward the cultural identity of the builders. Throughout this process, collaboration with indigenous knowledge keepers would be essential, not as a token gesture toward reconciliation, but as a genuine research partnership based on the recognition that indigenous knowledge systems contain relevant information about the past, and that their integration with archaeological investigation has the potential to produce results that neither system could achieve alone. This is the investigation that these features deserve. It is an investigation that could be conducted within existing archaeological methods and within existing budgets if it were made a priority. It has not been made a priority. That is the most important thing to say about the state of knowledge on this subject. Not that the mystery is insoluble, but that it has not yet been seriously attempted. Here is what I believe, for whatever it is worth, after spending time with this material. I believe the walls are real. I believe they are the work of human hands. I believe they were built by people who had purposes that we have not yet understood, working in a landscape that looked different from the one that exists today, in a cultural and historical context that our current narrative of North American prehistory does not adequately describe. I believe the people who built them were as intelligent, as purposeful, and as fully human as any people who have ever lived. I believe they had beliefs that organized their world in ways that gave meaning to the labor of placing one stone on another in a cold and windswept place, far from the warmth and comfort that any human being naturally desires. I believe their story is part of our story, part of the larger story of what this species has done and can do, of how far back our history really extends, and how much of it we have yet to recover. And I believe the walls are patient. They have been waiting 10,000 years for someone to come along and ask the right questions. We are getting closer, the questions are getting better, the tools for answering them are improving. The willingness to take the anomaly seriously, rather than dismissing it or explaining it away, is growing. The walls are patient, they can wait a little longer. There is a particular quality of light in the Arctic in late summer, a quality that people who have been there describe as unlike any other light in the world. It is low light, coming from a sun that never gets very high in the sky, light that illuminates horizontally rather than from above, that catches the edges of things, that makes the landscape read differently than it would under a direct overhead sun. In that light, the stone features of northern Canada become more legible. The long shadows they cast make their shapes clear. The contrast between disturbed and undisturbed ground is heightened. The details of construction, the specific way that individual stones were placed and fitted, become visible. This is the light in which the features were built. The builders were working in this light, in this season, knowing that the Arctic winter would return and that what they built would be covered in snow and impossible to work on for many months. The late Arctic summer was the building season, the weeks between ice breakup and the first return of the cold, when the ground was workable and the days were long and the light lasted almost continuously. Building in that light, under that sky, with the knowledge of the coming darkness, is an experience that anyone who has worked in the high latitudes understands viscerally. There is a quality of urgency to the Arctic summer, a sense that the window is brief and that what can be done must be done now, because the cold will come again. The people who built the walls knew that urgency. They worked in it, shaped by it, building as much as they could in the time they had. And then the winter came, and the snow covered the walls, and the builders moved to wherever they spent the long dark season, and the walls waited under the snow for the return of the light. And they have been waiting, under many winters, through many returns of the light, through the entire span of human civilization as we know it, for someone to come and ask what they are and why they were built. We are asking. And the asking, imperfect and incomplete as it is itself a form of respect for the people who built them. It is an acknowledgement that they were here, that they mattered, that their choices and their labor and their purposes deserve to be understood. The Canadian North holds many mysteries. The walls are one of the most compelling, and the difficulty of their interpretation is proportional to their importance. The easy mysteries are not the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the mysteries that resist easy resolution, that require new tools and new frameworks and new collaborations to address, that push the boundaries of what we think we know into genuinely new territory. The walls of northern Canada are that kind of mystery. They have pushed the boundaries of what we think we know about who was in the Americas and when, and what they were capable of. They are still pushing, and the direction they are pushing in, toward a more complex, more ancient, and more capable picture of pre-Columbian humanity in North America, is the direction that the best evidence is pointing. Follow the evidence. That is what science asks of us. Follow the evidence, even when it leads to places that are uncomfortable, that require revision of established stories, that open questions we did not know to ask. The walls are evidence. They are there, in the landscape, built by hands, patient and cold. Follow them. Let us spend our last hours together in a more intimate register. Let us think not about the grand narrative of pre-Columbian North American prehistory, important as that narrative is, but about the human reality of what it means to build something in a difficult and beautiful place, and what it means for that building to survive. There is a person at the beginning of this story, not an abstraction, a specific person, a real flesh and blood human being who looked at the land and saw in it a possibility that required stone to express. We cannot know that person's name or language or the specific content of their beliefs. We cannot know whether they were a man or a woman, young or old, a leader or a worker following someone else's vision. We can know only that they were there in that cold and luminous landscape and that they chose to build something. The choice to build is one of the most fundamentally human choices. It is the choice to say that the world as it is not yet the world as it should be, and that human hands can bridge the gap between the two. It is the choice to invest effort, not in immediate survival, but in something beyond survival, in something that expresses meaning or defines territory or honors the dead or speaks to the sky. Building is what humans do when they have enough, when they are, for the moment, safe and fed and present in a place that matters to them. The builders of the northern Canadian walls had enough. They had enough to stand in that landscape and see it not only as a place to hunt and fish and camp, but as a place that could be shaped, that could be marked, that could be made to speak of their presence and their purposes. That surplus, that sufficiency beyond bare survival, is what made the walls possible, and the existence of the walls tells us, however obliquely, that the people who built them had achieved that sufficiency. They were not desperate. They were not struggling at the edge of extinction. They were people with enough, building something that expressed the fullness of what they had. This is the most important thing the walls tell us, not where the builders came from, or what specific culture they belonged to, or how precisely they fitted the stones together. The most important thing is that they had enough. That in northern Canada, in the deep past, there were people whose lives included the luxury of building something that did not need to exist for survival to occur. That is the deepest expression of human flourishing that archaeology can document. And that flourishing, in that landscape, at that time, is something worth knowing about. It is something that expands our sense of what human life has been, of the variety and richness of human experience across the long sweep of our species' history. It tells us that the story of humanity is not only the story of struggle and survival and gradual progress toward the complexity of modern civilization. It is also the story of people who, in places we would not think to look, achieved their own forms of richness and meaning, and left their traces in the most permanent material available to them. The walls are those traces. They are what remains of a flourishing that we can barely imagine, in a world we cannot fully reconstruct, by people we cannot name. They deserve to be treated with the same respect and seriousness that we accord to any monument of human achievement, anywhere in the world, in any period of history. When the permafrost continues to thaw, as it will, as the Arctic climate continues to warm at a rate that is unprecedented in recorded history, more of what is buried will come to the surface. More features will emerge from the ground. More artifacts will thaw out of the permafrost where they have been frozen for thousands of years. More of the hidden record of the human past in northern Canada will become visible. That process is also a loss, because what the permafrost preserves, the slow thaw can destroy. Organic materials that have been maintained intact by continuous freezing will decay rapidly once they are exposed to air and moisture and warmth. The window for studying what emerges is short, and the window is narrowing as the pace of warming accelerates. This is one of the less discussed consequences of climate change, the destruction of an irreplaceable record of human history. The Arctic permafrost is the world's largest cold storage archive, preserving organic materials that have been lost to decay everywhere else. As that archive melts, the past is being lost in ways that cannot be reversed. What is not documented now will not be available to future researchers who may have better tools and better questions. The urgency of this situation deserves recognition. The walls themselves, being stone, will not be destroyed by the thaw, but the context that surround them, the organic materials that might date them, and that might tell us about the people who built them, are vulnerable. The associated middens, the wood or bone objects that may have been part of the construction or use of the features, the plant material that might have been burned in fires nearby, all of this is at risk from the same thaw that is exposing new features. The race between the climate and the archaeologists is real, and the stakes are the irreplaceable record of who was in northern Canada and what they built and what it meant to them. Let us return one final time to the walls themselves. Let us think about what it would mean to stand in front of them in the low Arctic light and to know what you now know about what they might be and who might have built them. You would stand at the base of a rise in the terrain, on the open tundra of the Ungava Peninsula, the land stretching away in all directions to a horizon that is very far off because the land is so flat and the air is so clear. The sky is enormous, the kind of sky that can only exist in places where there are no tall buildings or trees to interrupt it, the kind of sky that makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and at home in the universe in a way that is difficult to explain. The wind is blowing because the wind is always blowing, and on the rise above you there is stone. Not random stone, not the scattered erratics left by the glacier, but stone placed deliberately, stone fitted to stone in a line that extends along the ridge for enough distance that you cannot explain it without invoking a mind. A human mind. Someone's intentions, crystallized in rock. You would feel, standing there, the particular kind of awe that comes from being in the presence of something very old and very deliberate. The same awe that people feel at Stonehenge, or at the great temples of Angkor Wat, or at the cave paintings of Lascaux. The awe of recognizing another mind across a gap of time so vast that it is effectively incomprehensible. Recognizing it in the work of that mind's hands, in the choice that mind made to place this particular stone, in this particular way, in this particular place, you would feel connected, across 10,000 years of distance, across the unbridgeable gap between their world and yours. You would feel the connection that the builders intended to establish, the connection between what they did and what anyone who came after them might see and touch and wonder about. And you would feel the responsibility that comes with that connection, the responsibility to ask the right questions, to bring every tool and every form of knowledge to bear on understanding what these walls are and who built them, to resist the temptation of easy answers in either direction, whether that means dismissing the walls as natural formations or leaping to exotic explanations that the evidence does not support, to be patient with the mystery and rigorous in the investigation, and honest about what is known and what remains unknown. The walls require that of us. They deserve it. The story of the walls of northern Canada is not finished. It is, in a real sense, just beginning. The best work on this subject lies ahead of us, in the hands of researchers who will use tools that do not yet exist to answer questions that are only now being formulated clearly. The mystery is real, the evidence is real, and the understanding, when it comes, will be real. And in the meantime, the walls stand, patient, cold. 10,000 years of winter settling on them. 10,000 springs thawing them back into visibility. They have been here through everything, through the rise and fall of civilizations they never knew about, on continents they may or may not have been connected to, through the arrival of the people who now call this land home, through the centuries of colonial disruption, through the long and painful process of indigenous peoples reasserting their relationship to a landscape that was taken from them. Through all of it, the walls stood. They stand now. They will stand tomorrow. And someday, the right hands will come with the right instruments and the right questions and the right respect, and the walls will finally have the chance to say what they have been waiting to say. That will be a remarkable day. But tonight, the wind moves across the tundra, and the stars come out above the Ungava Peninsula. the same stars that the builders watched from this place, rising in the same configurations, turning through the same slow arcs across the northern sky. And the walls are quiet, as they have always been quiet, holding their story in stone. Somewhere above you, the aurora moves, green and white, occasionally touched with red. It ripples and shifts in ways that look purposeful, that look like something communicating in a language just at the edge of comprehension. The people who built these walls would have seen this same aurora, would have had names and stories for what it means and what it does, would have understood it in the context of a worldview that integrated the sky and the land and the stone into a single coherent experience of existence. We have lost that integration. We have gained other things in its place, technologies and understandings and connections across distance that those ancient builders could not have imagined. But the loss is real too, the loss of the sense that everything is connected, that the stone and the sky and the person standing between them are parts of a single story. The walls, in their silence, suggest that story. They are an invitation to recover it, or at least to acknowledge that it once existed and that it shaped the lives of real people in a real place for a very long time. The land does not forget, and perhaps, in time, neither will we. Sleep well. The walls are standing, the stars are turning. Somewhere in the deep Canadian north, in the cold and the dark, and the extraordinary beauty of a landscape that has been old since before our species began, the stones that someone placed there thousands of years ago are waiting for the dawn. There is a question that serious researchers who have worked in the field on this topic return to repeatedly, and it is a question that the physical evidence, taken alone, cannot answer. It is the question of what the walls meant to the people who built them in the moment of building, not what they mean to us, looking back across 10,000 years, not what function they served in the abstract terms of archaeological classification, but what it meant, concretely and immediately, to the person or persons who decided that these stones needed to be placed in this arrangement, in this place. The meaning of a monument is embedded in the moment of its creation. You can read backwards from the monument itself towards some of the parameters of its creation. You can say, this required organized labor, therefore there were people who organized it. This required selection of specific stone, therefore there were people with knowledge of materials. This required sustained effort over time. Therefore, there were people committed enough to the project to see it through the discomfort and difficulty of working in a demanding environment. These are structural inferences, and they are legitimate. But the meaning, the specific symbolic or ritual or territorial or cosmological significance that motivated the building is largely inaccessible to us from the physical evidence alone. We can approach it through analogy, through comparison with other cultures in similar environments that built similar things, and for whose motivations we have better evidence. We can approach it through the oral traditions of the descendants or near descendants of the builders. We can approach it through the specific details of construction that might indicate a ceremonial rather than a practical purpose, an orientation toward a specific astronomical event, the use of a specific type of stone that had symbolic significance in related cultures, the presence of offerings or ritual deposits within or adjacent to the feature. But we cannot know it fully, and the partial nature of our knowledge of the meaning is itself significant. It means that the walls speak to us across time in a language we only partially understand, in a vocabulary we are still compiling. Every piece of new evidence is a new word in that vocabulary. Every new analysis a better grasp of the grammar. Let us spend some time with the astronomical dimension, because it has been mentioned several times in this account without being examined in the detail it deserves. The relationship between stone monument building and astronomical observation is one of the most extensively documented phenomena in prehistoric archaeology worldwide. From the alignment of the Newgrange Passage tomb in Ireland with the winter solstice sunrise, to the orientation of the Great Pyramid of Giza toward cardinal points and specific stars, to the astronomical alignments of the standing stones of Callanish in Scotland, to the solar and lunar orientations documented at dozens of Mesoamerican and North American sites, the embedding of astronomical knowledge in built stone structures is a genuinely global phenomenon that spans a very wide range of cultures and time periods. Why? What is the relationship between stone and the sky that so many independent human cultures have felt the need to express? Part of the answer is practical. In pre-literate cultures, The sky is the primary calendar, the only reliable indicator of the passage of time across the cycles of seasons that govern agricultural and hunting activities. Knowing exactly when the winter solstice occurs, knowing when the spring equinox marks the beginning of the growing season, knowing the timing of animal migrations and fish runs, and the ripening of wild foods, all of this is practically important information that the sky provides, if you know how to read it. Embedding that knowledge in stone, creating a fixed architectural reference that can be used to verify the sky's messages year after year, is a practical investment that pays dividends in the form of better timing of subsistence activities. But the practical explanation is not sufficient. The elaborate care taken in building many prehistoric astronomical monuments goes far beyond what is necessary for simple calendar keeping. The scale, the precision, the artistic and symbolic elaboration of sites like Stonehenge, or the Caracol at Chichen Itza, or the medicine wheels of the Great Plains, suggest that astronomical observation in these cultures had dimensions beyond the practical, that the relationship between human beings and the sky was understood as a relationship between the human and the divine, between the temporal and the eternal, between the contingent world of everyday experience and the ordered, cyclical, dependable world of celestial motion. Stone monuments at astronomical sites are, in this understanding, interfaces between the human world and the cosmic order. They are the places where the regularity of the sky is made visible and accessible in the landscape, where human beings can position themselves in proper relationship to the forces that govern their world. They are sacred, in the specific sense that the word originally meant, set apart from ordinary experience, connected to the non-ordinary, to the realm of powers greater than individual human beings. If the anomalous stone features of northern Canada include examples of this kind of interface, then understanding them requires understanding not just their physical characteristics, but the cosmological framework within which they were meaningful. That cosmological framework is largely inaccessible to us, but the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region, the Inuit and Cree and others who have inhabited this landscape for many generations, preserve fragments of cosmological understanding that may be distantly related to what the builders of the features believed. The Inuit concept of sila, often translated as air or atmosphere or the breath of the world, is a cosmological principle of fundamental importance. Sila is not just the physical air but the animating principle of the universe, the force that makes things alive and connected. Sila permeates everything: the wind, the stones, the animals, the people. The relationship between a human being and Sila is a relationship between the individual and the totality of existence, and it is a relationship that requires constant attention and maintenance. Disruptions to the relationship between a community and Sila, through improper behavior, through failure to observe appropriate rituals, through neglect of the non-human presences in the environment, result in misfortune in the form of bad hunting, bad weather, illness. The maintenance of the relationship with Sila, in many Inuit traditions, involves specific practices at specific locations. Places where Sila is particularly present or particularly accessible are places of ritual importance, places where the attention of the community is regularly focused. It is not difficult to imagine that such places might be marked with stone, that the act of building at a place of ritual importance is itself a ritual act, a way of attending to the relationship with Sila that the place embodies. If this is a plausible reading of the motivation behind some of the northern Canadian stone features, then the features are not simply walls in the architectural sense. They are expressions of a cosmological relationship between human communities and the landscape, between people and the forces that they understood to govern their lives. They are, in a word, sacred, and understanding them requires approaching them with the respect that sacred things deserve, not the reductive analysis that treats them only as data. This does not mean abandoning empirical investigation. It means expanding the toolkit of investigation to include the kinds of understanding that sacred things require. It means listening to the people whose traditions have maintained continuity with the cultural world in which the features were built, even if that continuity is partial and distorted by time. It means approaching the mystery with the humility that comes from recognizing that what we do not know about the deep past is very much larger than what we do know. There is another angle on this story that deserves exploration, one that connects the mystery of the northern Canadian walls to a broader phenomenon of ancient engineering and landscape modification that is only beginning to be systematically studied. This is the phenomenon of ancient terraforming, the large-scale modification of natural landscapes by human hands for purposes that range from the practical to the ceremonial. The Amazon basin, long assumed to be a pristine wilderness, has been revealed by modern archaeology to be a landscape that was extensively shaped by human hands over many centuries. The terra preta, or dark earths, of the Amazon, extraordinarily fertile soils that were created through the deliberate addition of charcoal and organic material over generations, are evidence of sophisticated land management on a large scale. The geoglyphs of the Amazon, geometric earthworks covering thousands of square kilometers, are evidence of landscape modification for purposes that appear to be ceremonial rather than practical. The raised field systems of the Amazon basin are evidence of agricultural engineering on a continental scale. The Amazon terraforming is estimated to have involved millions of people working over centuries. It transformed a significant portion of the South American continent, and it was essentially invisible to Western science until the late 20th century, partly because the forest had grown back over the evidence, and partly because the assumption that pre-Columbian Amazonia was a pristine wilderness made researchers reluctant to see the evidence of human modification that was, in fact, abundant. The lesson of the Amazon is relevant to northern Canada. If millions of people in the Amazon were modifying a continental landscape for purposes that Western science failed to recognize for centuries, what might a much smaller population in northern Canada have done to their landscape that we are similarly failing to recognize? The modification would necessarily be smaller in scale, because the population was smaller and because the permafrost environment limits what can be done with earth-based modification. But stone is always available, and stone modification, the building and arrangement and placement of stone in meaningful configurations, is exactly what the anomalous features of northern Canada represent. Could the landscape of the Ungava Peninsula and northern Baffin Island and the other regions where anomalous stone features have been documented be, in some sense, a terraformed landscape, a landscape that was extensively modified by human hands for purposes that we are only beginning to understand? The features documented so far are scattered and disconnected in our current understanding. But if they are components of a larger pattern of landscape modification, a pattern that becomes clear only when all the components are mapped and analyzed together, then what we are looking at is not a collection of isolated anomalies, but a coherent human project on a landscape scale. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that is made more plausible by what has been found in the Amazon. Large-scale human modification of northern landscapes is not inherently implausible. The people of northern Canada had the time, the motivation, and potentially the numbers, if we are wrong about population density in the region during the Holocene thermal maximum, to accomplish a significant landscape-scale project over multiple generations. The shape of that project, what it was intended to accomplish, and how, remains unknown, but the walls are its trace, and the walls are real. There is a specific and under-discussed aspect of the human experience of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene that is relevant to understanding the people who may have built the northern Canadian walls. This is the experience of living in a world that was rapidly and dramatically changing, in which the landscape of one's grandparents was significantly different from one's own landscape, in which the changes were both opportunities and threats, and required constant adaptation. The people who inhabited the margins of the retreating ice sheet were living in conditions of permanent flux. The land was constantly changing under their feet, literally. Glacial lakes were forming and draining. River systems were shifting course. Sea levels were rising and swallowing coastlines that had been inhabited for generations. The land itself was rising as the weight of the ice came off it, creating new terrain while the sea was simultaneously encroaching on old terrain. The fauna was changing, with the great megafauna disappearing from region after region as hunting pressure and climate change combined to eliminate the enormous herds that had characterized the Pleistocene landscape. This was not an easy time. It was a time that required cognitive and social flexibility of an extreme kind. The ability to learn new things rapidly, to abandon strategies that had worked for generations when the conditions that made them work disappeared, to incorporate new resources and new landscapes into a cultural framework built on older patterns. The people who succeeded in this environment were not the most conservative, but the most adaptable, the most willing to learn and change and try new approaches. Building in stone, if it was something new, something that emerged in response to the specific conditions of the post-glacial period, would be exactly the kind of adaptation we would expect from people with those qualities. The ability to read a changing landscape and respond to it with permanent markers, to establish a claim on terrain that was new and contested, to define territory in a world where territorial boundaries were shifting as rapidly as the landscape itself. These are the kinds of adaptive responses that the conditions of the early Holocene would have selected for. The walls may be markers of a world in transition, built by people who understood that the world was changing and who responded by writing their presence into the landscape in the most permanent language available to them. In a world of flux, permanence is a powerful statement. In a world where the land that your parents knew is different from the land your children will know, building something that will be there for both is a way of asserting continuity, of claiming a thread of identity that the changing world cannot simply wash away. This is a deeply human motivation, and it suggests that the people who built the walls were not merely responding to practical needs, but were working through, in their own way, the same challenges of identity and continuity and meaning that human beings in all times and places face when the familiar world is being taken away. We face a version of those challenges today. The world is changing around us at a rate that feels unprecedented, though in fact the people of the early Holocene would recognize the experience, if not the specific content. The tools and strategies that worked for previous generations are becoming obsolete. New landscapes, including digital and social landscapes, are being created with a speed that outpaces our ability to understand and adapt to them. The familiar world of our parents and grandparents is being replaced by something different and partially unknown. In that context, the walls of northern Canada speak to us with unexpected relevance. They say, in a world of change, people make things that last. They write themselves into the landscape with the most permanent materials they have. They build not just for themselves, but for whatever comes after, for the unknown future people who will stand in the same place and wonder what the stones mean. We are those future people. We are standing in the place the builders imagined, wondering about the stones. And our wondering is, in its own way, a kind of continuity, a thread connecting us across the gulf of time to the people who placed those stones and hoped that someone would eventually come to ask why. Let the asking continue. Let the walls stand in their ancient patience. And let the mystery remain what it has always been, not a problem to be solved and filed away, but a living question that keeps pulling us back into the deep past of a continent we think we know, reminding us how much we still have to learn. The Arctic night is long. The stones do not notice it. They have survived many thousands of Arctic nights, and they will survive many thousands more, long after the questions being asked about them today have been answered or superseded or forgotten. But for now, in this moment, the questions are alive. And that aliveness, that persistent human curiosity about what the stones mean and who placed them there, is itself a kind of monument to the people who built them. A monument made not of stone but of attention, of the sustained refusal to look away from a mystery that deserves better than easy answers. The walls are waiting, the questions are alive, and the stars above the Ungava Peninsula are the same stars that the builders watched from the same ground, turning in their slow circles above the ancient rock of the Canadian Shield, above the stones that someone placed deliberately in the cold, in the wind, under that enormous sky. Sleep well. The mystery endures, the walls stand. And somewhere in the deep Canadian north, something built into the ancient land 10,000 years ago is still here, patient and cold and full of questions that the right minds, asking the right questions, with the right respect for everything they do not know, might one day finally learn to read. Consider, for a moment, the specific experience of the person who placed the last stone on one of these walls. The final stone in a construction is a moment of completion, of seeing the thing that existed only in the mind made real in the world. There is, in every act of building, a moment when the builder steps back and looks at what they have made and knows that it is done. That moment is a form of satisfaction available only to beings who can hold a concept in the mind and then execute it with their hands, who can envision something that does not exist and then make it exist. It is a specifically human moment, and it happened on the ridges above the rivers of northern Canada thousands of years before anyone in the conventional narrative knew those ridges were inhabited. Whatever else we can say about the walls, that moment of completion happened. Someone stood back and looked at the finished work and felt, in whatever way a human being 10,000 years ago felt such things, that it was done. That is not nothing, that is everything. The archaeology of completion, of finished things, is one of the most neglected dimensions of the study of prehistoric construction. We focus on the beginning, on the motivation and the planning, and on the result, the structure that survived. We rarely think about the middle, the process of construction, the daily experience of the work, the decisions made along the way about what to change and what to keep, what worked and what needed to be redone. And we almost never think about the end, the moment when the work was finished and the builders transitioned from builders to the people who had built something, who had created a new feature in their landscape that had not existed before. That transition is a form of authorship. The builders of the northern Canadian walls are, in a real and meaningful sense, the authors of those walls. They made something that did not exist, and by making it they changed the world, at least the small piece of the world that is the landscape of northern Quebec and Baffin Island. They added to the world a feature that expresses something about who they were and what they valued and what they understood. That expression persists, 10,000 years later, in stone. Authorship implies the possibility of readership. The builders made something to be seen, even if they could not have imagined by whom. The walls were legible, in their original cultural context, to anyone who shared the cultural framework that gave them meaning. As the cultural context changed, as the peoples of the region changed, the legibility of the walls diminished. The Dorset who came later would have been uncertain about what the walls meant, though they would have known they were old and significant. The Thule who replaced the Dorset would have known even less. The modern Inuit know the walls belong to a period before their own people's presence in the region, and we, approaching the walls from the perspective of the 21st century, know almost nothing of what they originally meant. But we can work toward understanding. We can bring every tool we have to the question of what these walls are and who made them and why. We can honor the builder's authorship by becoming the most careful and serious readers we can be. That is what this story has been. An attempt at reading, imperfect and incomplete and provisional, but genuine in its effort to do justice to what is written in the stone. There is a concept in archaeology called the palimpsest, borrowed from the world of manuscripts, where it refers to a parchment that has been written on, partially erased, and written on again, with the older text remaining faintly visible beneath the newer one. In archaeological usage, a palimpsest is a site or landscape where successive periods of occupation have left overlapping traces, where each layer of human presence has partially obscured and partially preserved what came before. The landscape of northern Canada is one of the most extraordinary palimpsests on Earth. Layer upon layer of human presence has been deposited in it, from the earliest hunter-gatherers who followed the retreating ice across the newly exposed terrain, to the pre-Dorset and Dorset and Thule peoples, to the modern Inuit and Cree who live in and know this landscape today. Each layer is partially preserved, partially erased. The stone of the Canadian Shield holds these layers simultaneously, and reading them requires the ability to see multiple periods of time at once, to recognize that what looks like a single landscape is in fact a superposition of many landscapes, each one belonging to a different moment in the long story of human presence in the north. The anomalous stone features on this reading are one layer of the palimpsest. They belong to a specific period, a specific cultural moment that has been partially overlaid by subsequent periods. The Dorset used this landscape after whoever built the walls and left their own traces. The Thule used it after the Dorset and left their traces too. The modern Inuit and the researchers who have come to study the region have added their own marks. The walls persist beneath all of this accumulated presence, visible still in the right light, from the right angle, to an observer who knows how to look. Learning to look at a palimpsest requires patience and practice. It requires the ability to distinguish between the traces of different periods, to identify what belongs to which layer, to see the older traces through and around the newer ones. In manuscripts, scholars do this with ultraviolet light and multispectral imaging, technologies that make the erased text visible again. In archaeology, the equivalent technologies are increasingly sophisticated. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, hyperspectral imaging from satellites, isotopic analysis of soil and stone. These technologies are being applied to the northern Canadian landscape, and what they are revealing is that the palimpsest is deeper and more complex than anyone had previously recognized. The walls are part of that depth. They belong to an early layer of the palimpsest, a layer that was laid down when the landscape itself was still being formed by the retreat of the ice, when the world was new and changing and full of possibility. And they persist, legible still to anyone willing to look, beneath the accumulated weight of everything that has happened since. There is something important in the persistence. Stone is not the most efficient building material for cultures that move frequently, that cannot afford to invest labor in structures they may never use again, that need to be ready to leave when the seasons change or the game moves. The choice of stone in those circumstances is a significant choice. It says, this matters enough to be permanent. This is worth the extra labor of quarrying and fitting and placing heavy material when lighter materials would serve the immediate function just as well. The buildings that cultures make in stone are the buildings that reflect the deepest investment of that culture in a specific place. They are the evidence of a relationship with land that goes beyond mere occupation, beyond a hunter's casual use of a landscape that is simply where the game happens to be. They are the evidence of belonging, of the sense that this particular piece of ground is ours in some way that requires permanent marking. If that is what the northern Canadian walls express, then their builders were people with a deep and meaningful relationship to the specific landscape they inhabited. They were not simply passing through, they were home. What does it mean to be home in the subarctic, in a landscape that most of the modern world experiences, if at all, as hostile and alien? It means knowing the land in ways that make it not hostile but familiar. It means knowing where the caribou will cross in October, where the fish will run in July, where the rock is sheltered from the wind, where the water stays open longest in autumn. It means carrying in your body and your knowledge a map of the landscape so detailed that you could navigate it blindfolded if you had to, because in a whiteout blizzard you have had to. It means having names for every feature of the terrain, names that encode information about the nature and history of the place in ways that a map from a satellite cannot. The people who were home in this landscape, who had that depth of knowledge and that quality of relationship with the land, are the people most likely to have invested in building permanent features in it. They built because they were home. They built because they had something to say about their relationship to a specific place that could only be said in stone. That relationship has not ended. The Inuit who live in the communities of northern Canada today, the Cree who inhabit the boreal forests and tundra of Quebec and Ontario, the Naskapi and Montagnais and Innu of Labrador, they are all in relationship with this landscape. Their relationship is continuous, through all the disruptions of colonization and residential schools and forced relocation and economic marginalization, with the relationship that the earliest inhabitants of the region had with the same land. The thread has been pulled thin in places, nearly broken in others, but it has not been severed. And that thread connects the walls to the present, through generations of people who knew these places were old and significant, who preserved in their traditions the awareness that what is in the land is older than living memory. The walls are not only a mystery of the past, they are a responsibility of the present, a responsibility to the people whose ancestors may have built them and whose connection to the landscape that contains them is living and real. This is why the investigation of the anomalous stone features of northern Canada cannot be only an academic project. It must be a collaborative project, one that includes the people who are in living relationship with the landscape, not because of political correctness or institutional policy, though those things matter, but because the knowledge that the indigenous peoples of the region carry is genuinely relevant to the investigation. They know things about this landscape that no satellite or radar or soil sample can tell you. That knowledge belongs in the investigation. The collaboration is happening, in some places and in some forms. Inuit Kaujimajatuqangit, the Inuit system of knowledge, is increasingly recognized as a legitimate and valuable form of environmental and historical knowledge in the management of the Canadian Arctic. Cree knowledge keepers are involved in environmental assessments of their traditional territories, bringing their understanding of the land's history and ecology to bear on decisions that will affect the landscape for generations. Indigenous archaeology, the practice of archaeology conducted by and in collaboration with indigenous communities, is growing as a discipline. But the specific application of indigenous knowledge to the mystery of the anomalous stone features has been limited. The connections that exist between what the oral traditions say and what the physical evidence shows have not been systematically explored. This is partly because the academic archaeologists most familiar with the physical evidence are not always the ones most familiar with the relevant oral traditions, and partly because the traditions themselves are held in ways that make systematic academic application difficult. Oral knowledge is context-dependent in ways that written knowledge is not. It is most accurately understood and applied by people who are immersed in the cultural context that gives it meaning, not by outside researchers working from transcripts. The path forward requires building relationships, not just applying methods. It requires the patient work of establishing trust between academic researchers and indigenous communities, of creating collaborative frameworks that respect the different knowledge systems being brought together, and of being genuinely open to what those knowledge systems reveal. That work is slow, and it cannot be rushed, but it is the only path that leads to an understanding that does justice to what the walls are and what they mean. In the high summer of the Arctic, when the sun circles the horizon without setting, when the tundra blazes briefly with wildflowers, and the rivers run with fish, and the birds that have spent the winter in the south are raising their young in the brief abundance of the polar summer, the landscape of northern Canada reveals itself as something other than the hostile void it appears to be in winter. It is alive, generously, explosively alive, in ways that are easy to miss if you only know it from the outside. The people who built the walls knew this aliveness. They had lived through many winters to earn the right to the summer. They knew that what looked dead in the dark was waiting, that the land's capacity for life was not diminished by the ice and the cold, but was simply held in reserve, waiting for the warmth and the light to release it. They built in stone because they knew that the land's capacity for persistence, its deep and patient permanence beneath the seasonal fluctuations, was something to honor and reflect in what they made. The walls reflect the land's own character back at it. They are stone in a landscape of stone. They are permanent in a landscape whose permanent features, its bedrock, its ancient rock, have been there for billions of years. They say, in the language of stone, that the people who built them understood this quality of the land and chose to speak in its own idiom. That is what the best monuments do. They do not impose a foreign vocabulary on the landscape. They draw out the vocabulary that is already there, amplify it, make it speak to the human needs that the builders brought to the place. Stonehenge speaks in the language of the chalky upland it stands on, in the stone that is native to its region, oriented toward the celestial events that govern the agricultural cycles of its landscape. The pyramids of Giza speak in the language of the desert, in the limestone and granite of the Nile Valley, oriented toward the stars that governed the religious imagination of their builders. The walls of northern Canada speak in the language of the Canadian Shield, in the ancient crystalline rock of the most enduring part of the North American continent. They are, in this sense, a completely natural expression of the people and the place that produced them. Whatever their specific purpose, whatever the cultural logic that motivated their construction, they belong here. They are as native to this landscape as the caribou that cross it in autumn and the aurora that ripples above it in winter. They are as much a part of what northern Canada is as the bedrock itself, and that perhaps is why the mystery of the walls is ultimately not troubling but comforting, if you can let it be. It tells us that this landscape has been home to people for longer than we knew, that those people were fully present in it and deeply engaged with it, that they built beautiful and purposeful things in it and left those things for us to find. It tells us that the human story in North America is deeper and richer than we have acknowledged. It tells us that the land holds history that we are only beginning to learn to read. The walls are an invitation to look more carefully, to ask better questions, to honor the people who came before by taking their work seriously, by refusing to reduce it to footnotes or anomalies or embarrassments to be explained away, to approach the mystery with the combination of rigor and humility and respect that it deserves. Accept the invitation. The walls are waiting, the land is patient, the story is not over. It is, in fact, just beginning. There is one final thing to say about the walls, something that sits outside the archaeology and the geology and the cultural analysis, something that belongs more properly to the category of direct human experience. To be in the presence of something very old and very deliberate is to feel, in a way that is difficult to fully articulate, the weight of time. Not the abstract time of physics, not the mathematical time of the calendar, but experience time, lived time, the time that is made of individual lives and choices and moments of effort and rest. The time that the builders of the walls lived through is the same kind of time you and I live through. It had the same texture, the same mixture of urgency and waiting, of effort and rest, of meaning and confusion. It was real time, and the people who moved through it were real people, as real as you are lying there in the dark with this voice in your ear. They built something. Against the cold and the wind and the difficulty of the work, they placed one stone on another and another and another, and they kept at it until the thing they had imagined was made real in the landscape. And then they walked away, or they stayed for a while and then walked away, and the thing they had built was left in the landscape to persist without them. 10,000 years later, you know it is there. You may not have stood in front of it, you may never stand in front of it, but you know it is there, and the knowing matters. It changes the story of what northern Canada is and what happened there. It adds a layer of human presence and human meaning to a landscape that has been described, until recently, as essentially empty of human history before the arrival of documented cultures. The walls refuse the emptiness. They insist on the presence of people who mattered, who built, who chose, who had purposes that sent them out into the cold to fit stone to stone in patterns that 10,000 years has not undone. That insistence is the most important thing about them. The Arctic is changing. The permafrost is thawing at a rate that has no precedent in the recorded history of the region. The sea ice that the Inuit have depended on for travel and hunting is thinner and less reliable than it has been in living memory. The animals that form the basis of the northern economy, the caribou, the seal, the polar bear, are shifting their ranges and their behaviors in response to conditions that are changing faster than those animals can easily adapt to. The north is in upheaval, and in the midst of that upheaval, the ancient stones persist. They predate the current crisis. They will outlast it, whatever its ultimate resolution. They have survived 10,000 years of climate change, from the cold of the late Pleistocene to the warmth of the Holocene thermal maximum, and back again through the cooler periods of the last 2,000 years. They have witnessed the full range of variation that the Arctic climate has produced in the time since human beings first arrived on the shores of Hudson Bay. The stones know something about persistence, about the difference between what changes on a human timescale and what endures on a geological one, about the relationship between the urgent concerns of any given moment and the longer arc of time in which those concerns are embedded. The walls stand in that longer arc, reminders of what was here before and what will be here after. There is something steadying about that, if you let it be. The world is always in upheaval. Every generation experiences its own version of unprecedented change, its own sense that the familiar is being swept away and replaced by something uncertain and new. The people who built the walls of northern Canada lived in a world of unprecedented change, watching the ice retreat and the landscape transform beneath their feet. They built anyway. They made something permanent in the middle of all that flux. We can do the same. Not in stone, necessarily, but in the accumulation of careful attention, of honest inquiry, of the sustained refusal to accept the easy story when the real story is harder and richer and more worthy of the people it belongs to. The real story of northern Canada's past is harder and richer than the conventional narrative. The walls are part of that story, and the work of recovering that story, of doing justice to the people who lived it, is part of what we owe them and owe ourselves. The wind is blowing across the tundra, the stars are turning above the Ungava Peninsula, the stones are there in the dark, patient and old. Rest now. Dream of the deep past, of the world as it was when the ice was retreating and the land was new, and someone decided that something needed to be built. Dream of the builders, real and purposeful and fully human, going about the work of making their mark on a landscape that would hold that mark for 10,000 years and beyond. They are part of your story, however distant the connection. The stones are patient. They always have been. They wait without urgency, without complaint.